Hello all. Fairly new to Reddit and just discovered this forum, so please feel free to delete this if it doesn't fit the criteria. And also, this might be a little long, so I apologize, but I've never written this out before and never will again, so I figured I might as well tell the whole thing for myself, if no one else. This is the only creepy/scariest thing that's ever happened to me in my life, which is probably why it stands out so much in my memory. In hindsight, the location and general isolation probably made it seem much scarier than it was, but at the time it felt like I'd stumbled into the opening scenes of a full-on horror film. Anyway, here's the story. Just over 10 years ago, I was fresh out of college, and I moved back to my parents' house for the free rent and food for 9 months or so, before I was leaving the state for graduate school. Now, my parents are super chill, and gave me my own space in the house, but being a 22-year-old single guy and living in a house in the sticks, they had just recently moved about 40 miles south of a major Midwest city, is certainly not ideal. I didn't have any other options, so I started looking for some work, more to pass the time than to save up some money. Summer turned to winter, and I still hadn't found anything solid. But by then I was desperately needing to spend more of my time out of my parents' house, so I took a part-time gig doing some light bookkeeping for a small business owner that my dad knew. I didn't really want to do it since it didn't pay much, was short-term, and wasn't even a real office setup, but again, since my parents lived in the middle of nowhere Midwest, I knew I had limited local opportunities to make cash, and this guy was going to pay me under the table as well. About that same time, a friend of mine in the city said that if I just paid him $200 a month and helped clean up, he'd basically let me crash in his living room until I was ready to move out of state. That was all I needed to hear. I took the job. So my dad's friend's family had a construction-type business. They helped out with building stuff a little, but it was ultimately more focused on renting out a few bobcats and large augers they owned. Also other various drills, and then odds and ends like generators and other low-level construction or farming equipment that someone in that area couldn't afford to purchase but might need to use from time to time. This was a pretty small mom-and-pop type thing, where everyone knew everyone and the office only opened on days when someone was coming by. It was generally just a mutually beneficial situation for the business owners and the locals. Since I had minored in a business-adjacent area, and my dad recommended me, they trusted me to go in there for about 15 to 20 hours a week and check and file the rental forms. Make sure nobody missed a payment date if there was a payment plan in place, or answer an email or two discussing the prices and availability. A super easy gig. The old building where I worked was about, I think, 90 years old, and at the top of this little hill. The downstairs used to be an old country bar until the 1970s when this family bought it cheap, cleared out the bar, and fenced in the property to use its parking lot area to store all their rental equipment and gear. I could generally come and go as I pleased, work any hours I wanted to as long as the work got done, and so if things were slow and there weren't any rentals for a couple of days, I'd usually go in after 7 and stay until around midnight or 1. I knew I'd be alone and could listen to music loud and take my time and all that. The office where I worked was on the second floor of the building above the old bar and looked out onto the long driveway. From my seat, I could easily see out the window, and once or twice I saw a family of deer or a raccoon scamper by. I always glanced out when I saw movement, since it was very noticeable. It was incredibly remote, very still and quiet, so if something unusual occurred or if something felt off, I definitely noticed it. One night during winter, it had snowed a few inches, and my dad told me to stay in because the roads were bad. I had an old SUV, and more than that, just really wanted to get out of the house, so I went into work at about 8 p.m. and was going to stay until just after 1. I always left the gate open at the bottom of the hill, since believe me when I say that nobody ever showed up at night, since we were literally in the middle of nowhere. I think the nearest occupied house was about 2 miles down the road, and to even turn onto our short road you had to only be coming to our specific building, and no one was there beforehand. It was a locals-only type thing, and very small since the family had inherited a lot of money and did this kind of rental thing on the side. Basically, someone would never just get lost and end up at our building. So I'm jamming away to some Fallout Boy, everyone makes mistakes when they're young, and having some coffee, and kept glancing at the snow outside the window here and there. Our orangish streetlight reflected onto the ground at the gate, and was causing the light to shine off the snow in a really cool, and dare I say pretty way. At one point around midnight, I went downstairs to the big bathroom to do my bathroom business, and then came back upstairs and got settled back into my work. I probably did about 5 minutes of work, when I glanced outside and saw a huge imprint of something in the fresh snow just below the light. It seemed like it must have been a huge dog, or substantial animal had just rolled around on the ground there on its back or something. Since I didn't notice it just 15 minutes before, it had to have happened while I was in the bathroom, or maybe when my back was turned, since I would have seen that type of movement for sure. I shook it off and assumed a dog or maybe even a farm animal had gotten loose, and maybe was attracted to the light or something. Who knows? At around 2 in the morning I was leaving, and as always I got out of my car to lock the gate up. To be honest, I had pretty much forgotten about the imprint in the snow. But when I looked down, I was shocked to see that it wasn't just some disturbed snow, but was undeniably the imprint of a human-made snow angel. If you don't know what a snow angel is, it's when people lie on their back in the snow and push their arms and legs back and forth so they get up and it looks like the outline of an angel. I used to do this when I was a kid, so I 100% knew for sure that's what it was. It was deliberately made underneath the light post, but it wasn't from a kid. It must have been a very large person, or at least a normal-sized adult wearing tons of layers of big winter clothing. I looked up and saw what I already knew, that whoever had made this snow angel could easily look up and have seen me through that window, so they must have waited for me to head downstairs to make this angel. I definitely would have seen or heard if someone drove up to our building, even if I was in the bathroom, so I knew someone had to have walked deep into the freezing cold and snow for a few miles, stopped in front of our building, and then did a snow angel in the small amount of time I wasn't sitting in front of my desk window. I glanced around for tracks in the snow, and I saw that there was one set that led to the nearby woods to the right of the building. It was clear that the person hadn't used the road, but had instead come from the opposite side, which made me instantly uneasy. That side was just trees and darkness for miles and miles. I was definitely a little freaked out now once I realized that someone had just been this close to me secretly in the middle of the woods, and I looked around but didn't see anything amiss at all. Now I just wanted to get the hell out of there. When I got back in my car and drove a few feet, I realized that my boss would be there in about 4 hours, and might see the snow angel assume I did it, since he probably assumed I kept the gate locked when I was there. It wouldn't have been that big an issue at all, but I was young and felt like I might be made fun of by him if nothing else. They were all manly men, and I liked books. So I opened the gate back up real quick, ran over and kicked the snow around to hide the angel, and locked it up again and went back to my car. I almost lied here and said something else since it might seem fake. I assumed the average person wouldn't get back out of their SUV and not just flee in their car because they'd be embarrassed about a snow angel. But at that time I was very insecure and cared a lot about what others thought, so unfortunately that's what I did. Also, I wasn't exactly fully terrified at this point, even though it was certainly unsettling. I just thought it was really weird, and could have maybe been an illegal hunter. Either way, the imprint was made 2 hours earlier, and I assumed by this point they were long gone. But that's when I heard it. When I was getting into my SUV, there was the loudest high-pitched laughing coming from deep in the woods. It almost sounded like a fake laugh, like the witch in The Wizard of Oz or something, like someone was doing it fake on purpose to show they weren't scared of me, or to see how I'd react at all once I knew they were laughing at me on our property. It was close enough that I knew they could see me, but but I couldn't see them at all since other than the streetlight I was under, there was no illumination. After a few seconds of the laughing, they stopped, and then it was just silence everywhere except for the beating of my heart through my ears. Then the laughing started again, though louder this time, more like screaming than laughing. I sort of froze for like 5 seconds, listening in panic. I spent a lot of time in that area, and I know what coyotes and foxes sound like at night, with their high-pitched screeches during mating season, so I can't completely logically rule that out. But honestly, it felt like it was an adult man trying to emulate a woman, like someone was deliberately trying to make a fake scary shriek in order to scare someone. Well, it worked. After that 5 seconds, I was immediately filled with adrenaline. I got in my car and drove the hell away from there as fast as I could, without sliding off the road. Back at home, I was up all night trying to figure it out, and told my parents the story when they woke up. After talking it out, we decided it was one of two things. It was either my brain somehow convincing itself that the snow formation was angel-shaped when it was really just caused by an animal, and then the snow tracks and laughing had just come from a coyote or red fox, though I don't think that's what it was. What I truly believe, the second thing, is that some person was out walking around for some reason, and had decided to fuck with me. I didn't have any close friends left in that area that would do this, and if they did, they would certainly have brought it up to make fun of me for speeding away in terror. I found out later that the nearest house on that side was a very old couple, so I highly doubt it was one of them, which means whoever it was went out in the woods in the night, in the freezing cold just to mess with a stranger. I don't have any mental issues or family history of them. Didn't do drugs. I drank socially sometimes at the time, but certainly hadn't that night. I also don't believe in the paranormal, so I never once gave that a thought. I knew in my heart that someone was out there. I worked there another 6 weeks or so and never had a single issue, though I knew where my boss kept his gun, and I always made sure it was there when I started my shift. I certainly always locked the gate from then on. Thinking about this experience that night, the part that freaked me out the most was that he had to have waited around for me to leave for about 2 hours, just for him to do that laugh. He didn't know me. I could have been crazy and the type of person to get mad and try to find and attack him. Yet he didn't seem scared at all, or to care when he tried to mess with me. For some random person out there, this is probably a story he tells from his point of view, to make all of his friends giggle hysterically. But for me, that dude, the one I call Angel in the Snow guy, the one with the laugh I'll never forget. Let's never meet. I was 10. Every summer for the 9 years prior, I had spent at least 1 week at my grandmother's house in Maryland. It was a place where everyone knew everyone, a stark contrast to my South Florida home, where I barely knew the neighbors who were 1 house away. My grandmother could tell me the names of her neighbors, their kids, and even what grades they were in. They all knew and loved her, and so they looked after her. On this summer day, we were playing cards, as we often did, at her wooden dining room table. She lived in a red brick house that had a crawl space under it, so it was slightly elevated off the ground. One of the things I loved most about being at her house was the way that she would wake up every morning and open all the blinds to let the natural light shine in. As soon as the sun would set, she would close the blinds and we would retreat into the comfort of the lamp-lit, green shag-rugged living room to watch the evening news. This day, however, we started playing cards while the sun was still up, and being wrapped up in the game, well until after the sun had set. The phone suddenly rang, interrupting our focus. I jumped up, excited to answer. Hello? I didn't recognize the voice on the other line. All I could identify was the urgency in their pitch. Yes, can I speak with Mrs. C, please? Yeah, hold on. Grandma, it's for you. Who else would it have been for? She was the only one who had lived in that house for the last 12 years, since my grandpa had passed away. I sat at the kitchen table, closer to the pantry, where she kept her phone, and watched her with eager, curious eyes. I waited for her to tell me who was on the line, or for a hint in the conversation that might give it away. But she didn't tell me. In fact, the only thing she said before she hung up was, "Oh my. Okay, thank you." What could this be about? Granny, who was that? She wasn't paying attention to me. It was like I wasn't even in the room for her anymore. Grandma, who was it? What's wrong? What's going on? The urgency had transferred from the caller, through my voice and into her eyes. Her face twisted as she picked the phone up, this time to call the police. I grew worried, scared. The world felt like it was dissolving around me, but I didn't know how or why. I didn't even know it was the police she was calling. I just had to listen to her have the conversation to try and figure out what was even going on. Hi, yes. Can you send someone to my house on Elmbrook Drive? I have reason to believe there's a trespasser on my property. I strained to hear the response of the person on the other line, but all I could hear was my grandmother's now labored breathing. Okay, thank you. Again, she hung up the phone. By this time, I had started crying, feeling panicked. Again, my questions went unanswered, as she picked up the phone to call her next-door neighbor. Hi, sorry to bother you, it's Ola. Can you come over? Please bring your... She looked up and saw me as she closed the door. I could no longer hear what she was saying, but I distinctly heard the word gun. Things were getting real and fast. A minute later, she emerged to address me. Sweetheart, let's go to the bedroom. I need to meet Mr. R for a minute, and I just want you to stay in there until I tell you to come out, okay? What's wrong, Grandma? Why did you call the police? It came out in fractured segments as I caught my breath from all the crying. I'll explain everything soon enough. I sat in the bedroom and looked through the blinds to watch for the neighbor. A weak flashlight appeared in the yard from the left. It bounced up and down with each of his steps. Next to the flashlight, I could see the barrel of a shotgun, something I had only ever seen a handful of times, each one equally terrifying. The light bounced past the front door, and beyond the garage where he faded away from sight. A few painstaking minutes later, he was back at the front door and knocking. I heard my grandma let him in, muffled voices back and forth. She came and let me out of the room then. I still had no idea what was happening. My stomach was in my throat, my head pounding from the scared tears I couldn't stop shedding. I sat on the couch as the neighbor explained to my grandma that he would stay with us until the police had arrived, but that he believed that we were now in the clear. As I looked around, I noticed that the once open blinds had been hastily and haphazardly closed. Moments later, the police arrived. Like the neighbor, they walked to the back of the house with their lights and guns in hand. And when she spoke to them, I only heard bits and pieces. We were playing cards. The neighbor from across the way called on the phone. Watching us through the window. Called you. The police explained that the property was clear, but took us outside to show us where the man had left footprints in the mud, from the back gate leading up to and away from the window that sat at the end of the dining room table. There had been a man in the window watching us as we played cards. The neighbor to the back and across the soccer field had looked out their window to see the shadowed and hooded figure, backlit by the light from our open blinds. He had climbed atop a toolbox and sat below the window, just getting a clear sight of us. What he was planning, I'll never know. He must have been spooked by the phone call or a disruption in our game. I'll always be grateful for that neighbor who called. a neighbor that I never met. So I've never posted to this subreddit, so please forgive me for any formatting errors or whatever. Just a bit of context. I went to a small liberal arts college that had on-campus houses in addition to dorms. I was an RA, resident assistant, for a grouping of houses. I was in charge of a large house that had a lot of people. This happened in February of 2017. So in my junior year of college, I find a camera in my room. I had just returned home from dance rehearsal, so I took a shower, changed, fixed a poster, and watched some vines. As I'm getting ready for bed, I pick out a hair bow I wanted to wear the next day. Well, among all the hair bows, I spot a small black box. My first thought is that it's one of those funky little ant traps that the maintenance guy left there, which would be weird because I was an RA of that particular building and should have known about any maintenance. I picked it up and it had a bit of tape on it. I peeled back the tape to reveal a red light. Well, fuck. I flip it over and find some words. I don't remember exactly what it said, but it had the make and model of the camera. At that moment, I realized what it is, and my heart drops. I run down the hall to my two good friends' room and show them. We find there's an SD card still left in the camera. We want to look on it, but none of our laptops have an SD card reader. No biggie. My friend works at the library and says she'll rent a reader from them. Next day I come home from classes and take a peek at what my friends have found. Footage of me and several other girls in assorted buildings and rooms. There was no compromising footage of me, for which I'm very thankful, but there was footage from some other girls of the building peeing, brushing their teeth, and all sorts of other stuff. I didn't see all the footage, so I don't know exactly what else was on there. They then show me footage of the person hiding the camera. Yeah, you read that right. The person who hid the camera recorded themselves doing it, and I recognized them. They were another RA on the same staff team as me. At this point, I'm freaking out. I call our boss, who's doing interviews for next year's RAs, and go, "Dude, I have to talk to you right now." I tell him the situation, and he seems pretty calm. Says he'll take care of it, but he needs me to come to his office later that night. I say okay. The next part of that day was excruciating. I had to go to a dinner meeting for a campus organization I was president of. I was worried the person might come back and take their camera while I was gone, so I grabbed it and took it with me. My freshman year roommate was there with me, and on the drive home she asked me what was wrong. I told her and showed her the camera. As we were sitting in the parking lot, someone is walking towards my building. Who should it be but the fucker who hid a camera in my room? At this point, I'm having a full-on panic attack. My friend says she'll cover for me. She'll watch the house while I get out of there. I just book it away as fast as I can. I hid in another building until she let me know that he was gone and away. At this point, I meet with my boss. I tell him what happened, and he looks at the footage with his boss. I answer questions for campus security. Then I answer questions for the city police. My boss and I go back to my house to make sure there were no other cameras. They take the guy in question and put him in a detaining center of sorts. They keep him in an unoccupied suite in a dorm on campus. I don't sleep well at all that night. The next morning, I get no update of what's going on. I'm looking over my shoulder every 5 seconds, and I'm absolutely terrified that he's loose and going to come after me. And then I get a call. He's not allowed out of the room. I have to answer more questions for another police officer. And they tell me what they learned from him. He'd begun his voyeuristic shenanigans by hiding the camera in one of his fraternity brothers' rooms and managed to film him having sex. At this point, he went and hid the camera in the woman's bathroom and the bedrooms of his female students. I don't remember how many, but there were at least 7 people filmed. They arrested him, and he was in jail for 3 days, then released to get his stuff and go to his hometown until they had the school trial. During this time, the school has to tell our staff team that he'll no longer be there for the rest of the year. They refused to tell the team what happened, or to let me tell anyone. They said it was so that he could leave with his dignity, as if he deserved it. Months go by, and after many meetings with assorted people, they have his trial. He's expelled. A year later, he has his legal trial with the state the school I attend is in. I was never informed of the results. I still need to call the police station, and this was a few months ago. However, I did receive a restraining order in the mail. Somewhere during this mess, I figured out how he got in my house and how he hid the camera. He got into my house because he had been granted keycard access. I lived in a weird large house without keycards and not keys. He was granted this access because one of my residents needed help getting her stuff out for storage, but had accidentally mailed her keys and keycard back home. Apparently, security thought the best way to handle this was to give him a keycard access to her house. He knew exactly when I wouldn't be in the house, because the night it was hidden, we had a staff meeting, and I told our group chat I would be leaving a few minutes early to pick up snacks. He knew where I was going, and that I wouldn't be home. It sickens me to think that before he hid that camera, we were laughing in rehearsal together, and after he did it, we were joking around at our staff meeting. Just acting totally normal, as if he didn't just violate my privacy. Back in 2013, I was living with my ex at the time, who lived there in a nice country village, and as I was in between jobs at the time, I picked up a job at a local garden center. It was casual retail work, fairly decent pay, and easygoing enough that I could take coffee breaks frequently, and wear basically whatever I liked as long as I wore my work polo shirt. It was walking distance from my ex's house, and full of people of all ages who were the most lovely people I had ever met. Most of the regular customers who came to the garden center were sweet old people who would visit the cafe because we had free teas and discounted lunches for OAPs if they had a store card. You often got to know every single one of them, and some of them we even gave nicknames. Most of them sweet, like Pink-Haired Lady, a badass 80-year-old grandma who wore a tasseled leather jacket and bright pink hair. Then there was camper van couple who used to drive in a really cool camper van with bright orange flowers painted on it. You get the idea. With creepy artist man, though, he gave most of the young girls weird vibes. He wore a straw hat, was in his late 40s, and had round gold-rimmed glasses. He would wear strange graphic shirts with naked women on them, or Professional Pussy Patrol sort of slogans on the back. He always wore ripped jeans where his knees were always hanging out of them, which were always dirty with paint or mud or something. He had this weird half-smile that would never leave his face, and a kind of leer that made people feel uncomfortable. He would take off his glasses and clean them constantly, which kind of made you feel like he was trying to get a better look at the girls who worked there, especially the younger ones. 16-plus school leavers, usually. Anyway, it was a roasting hot summer's day, and I had gratefully accepted the job of watering the hanging baskets outside, where I could avoid the humid, sweaty heat of the greenhouses. I was wearing black shorts and my red polo, and my tool belt to prune and deadhead plants as well. With the hose in my hand and sunnies on my face, I was busy, but enjoying the solitary job at the quietest part of the garden center. Well, hello there. Out of practically nowhere, he slipped out behind some wooden trellises and looked me up and down, smiling with his weird, too small teeth. His eyes lingered on me for what felt like an uncomfortable few seconds, and I turned off my hose and asked him if he needed anything. He shook his head and kind of shrugged, still smirking at my legs. I'll call him CAG for ease. Okay, sir. Have a nice day. Let me know if you need anything. I turned to continue. I've never seen you here before. You're a new one? Huh? Me? I've been here for 8 months now. I must have missed the memo that a beauty like you started. You have a nice tan. You look young. Thanks. I'm 23. Anyways, I have to get back to work. Nice to meet you. I suddenly remember my name badge and get irritated that he now knew my full name. I make a beeline for the smoking area, where the tool shed was, with an excuse to grab some smaller gardening gloves, and by the time I returned to the floor, he had left. As the weeks went by, he would come into the store regularly, usually mid-afternoon, coincidentally, or so I thought, around the time I started my shift. Most of the time, I was the only cashier, so I would have to serve him. He would buy the smallest, most pointless things, like floristry wire or a tiny bag of birdseed. It seemed like he would purposely make a purchase with the intention of interacting with me. He would make comments about my appearance, statements mostly like, "You have your hair different today. Yesterday you had it down." Or, "You have new glasses." Or, "That's a different lip color to yesterday." He would always announce my name very loudly and deliberately during every interaction. It felt uncomfortable, but I was 23, and just politely shrugged it off. Around Christmas time, I was decorating the artificial trees, and he cornered me in the forest of them at the back of the store. He jumped out from behind one, and made me jump, to which I was kind of pissed about him doing so, because I dropped a glass ornament and it had smashed. He bent down also and tried to help, grabbing my wrist and telling me not to touch the glass. His grip was scarily tight and forceful, and his hands were clammy and gross. I slipped my hand out of his grip and asked if I could help him with anything. That's when it got weird. He pulled out a leaflet from his back pocket and told me that he was an artist and had a Christmas art show happening in the local church hall. He wanted me to go with him. He told me that he was a painter, and he thought I would like his work. I had never indicated I was interested in art to him or anyone else for that matter, which is why I thought this was so strange. I asked him if he wanted me to pin the leaflet to the local event board, and he reached out and touched my arm and said, "No, this invitation is specifically for you." He pointed his finger and jabbed it into my breast, and he said, "You." I'm standing there in a dark corner, obscured from view by artificial Christmas trees, just kind of cornered by this guy who was touching me. I cringed away and said, "I was busy with my boyfriend that day. Sorry," and kind of scampered off. I remember feeling really strange after that. The fact he grabbed my wrist and jabbed his finger into my chest that way. I told a few of my colleagues about it, and they all told me they would warn me next time he was in the store, so I could maybe hang out at the storeroom until he was gone. Well, that memo must have been missed by a few of the temp Christmas staff, because one day I get told by one, "Your friend is asking for you at the tills." It wasn't unusual for my friends to stop by, as it was fairly popular for gifts and the like, so thinking it was maybe my ex's mum or something, I head to the till, and there he is. He's holding a piece of paper. I cringe, but he had seen me now, so I walk over and ask what he needed from me. He passed the paper over and asked me to open it. Folded up was a drawing of me, with exaggerated breasts and cartoon-like eyes watering the hanging baskets with a sexual kind of position. I stood there and said thank you, but I couldn't keep it, as I thought it was inappropriate to take gifts from customers. I handed it back to him, and he looked at me with an angry stare. He turned around and walked out without another word. By this point, I had had enough. I knocked on my manager's door and told him about the whole scenario that just happened, all the previous interactions I had had with him over the past year. He watched the CCTV and agreed that it was so strange, the way he gave me the gross picture and told me he would talk to him if he came back. He praised me for my reaction to his advances and said I was doing the right thing and he would try to see him off the next time. The next day was a Sunday, and I was not due in to work. My boss calls me and tells me he just received a call from HQ, stating that an anonymous caller had called in to report a staff member inappropriately coming on to a customer. The staff member they had described and named was me. The caller had said that I had been inappropriate towards him at work, offered to have sex with him and had led him on, and was obviously promiscuous, that I had been pursuing him for over a year. The jerk even described a fictitious relationship we had had, and ranted loudly about how I had been cheating on my boyfriend before hanging up. HQ luckily didn't believe a word, as my manager had already mentioned the guy to one of the higher-ups, but they thought it was wise to let me know about this crazy guy, and suggested I reported it to police. The next day, I did just that. The officer I spoke to said he matched the description of a man who was a local pest, somebody who would often harass young girls in the local area. He was also known to stalk young girls in his car, and had attempted to abduct one 4 years ago. Police officers assured me they would file the report and talk to him officially, and that he was not allowed to be in the garden center or anywhere near me again. If he did, I was to call the police and he would be immediately arrested. Unfortunately, though, it never stopped him from sending a ranting letter to my workplace addressed to me, saying he would kill himself if I didn't take him back, and received his gift he drew of me. Fortunately, the police took this as unsolicited contact, and he was thankfully immediately arrested. I'm using a secondary account for obvious reasons. This event is still ongoing. However, I was hoping to seek some advice from you guys, because I honestly have no idea what to do. To begin with, I've always had this feeling that someone was watching me, ever since I moved into my family house 8 years ago. At first, I thought I had just watched too much ID investigation, and that I was being a bit paranoid. But I couldn't help looking over my shoulder when I would walk to school or to my bus stop. When I would walk to school, I was always scared in the mornings, when it would be dark during the winter or fall, because where I live is just vast country lands. I live in Canada, and though not much crime happens in my neighborhood, I could just never rid myself of this eerie feeling. Even when I would come home from school, being home alone didn't help. I would triple-check my windows and locks, just to make sure everything was locked up. However, in my basement, our garage door would never fully lock, since the door hinge was broken and detached from the door. Therefore, it could never properly close. I always told my dad to fix this door, but because he would always go away for work, he never found the time to do so. Stupidly, I thought nothing bad would happen, since my garage needed a 4-digit passcode to get in. On a side note, I just want to let everyone know that you should never, under any circumstances, put your birthday as your passcode for anything. Even if you switch up the date so that the day is first and the month is second, don't do it, because it's pretty obvious. Now my theory is that he knew the passcode to my house, therefore he had free reign for 7 years to go through my things. At first, I thought I was being forgetful. Maybe I was the one who misplaced my underwear somewhere. Maybe I was the one who misplaced my favorite top, or maybe my dad accidentally donated it. But I should have known better. During my 4 years of high school, he never really contacted me. It was when I went to university that things suddenly started to change. Since I lived in the countryside, I decided to go to university an hour away. My dad didn't want me to live on residence because he didn't want to leave the house unattended for long periods of time, so we came to the conclusion that it would be best if I drive to and from school. Now, I would leave for university very early in the morning, at around 6 a.m., and come back at around 6 p.m. at night. I stopped being aware of my surroundings at this time, because I would be tired from my 12-hour days, and now that I wasn't walking home alone anymore, everything would be fine. When I would come home from university, I would find certain things moved in my house. I'm a neat freak, and I may have mild OCD, so I like things in a very particular way in my house. Little things like my makeup or candles would be moved. I thought it was odd and would frequently bring it up to my dad, but he would just say that it must have been me who was doing it. But it wasn't me. During my second and third year in university, I started to get weird notes in my mailbox. The writing on these notes looked almost childlike, and it would always be written in blue ink. I have those country-style mailboxes at the end of my driveway, where the little red flag goes up whenever we get mail. From my way back from university, I would always check the mail, and sometimes I would find these letters. The letters would never be long. In fact, they would only ever be 1 to 3 sentences, and they would contain odd questions like, "Where are you? I wonder what you do while you're away from home. How do you find university? It must be tiring driving that long. Did you make new friends? Do you still hang out with your best friend? You dress differently now. Why is that? I miss the scarves you used to wear. You don't close your curtains as much anymore. Why don't you look for me?" These letters would always come once a month at the beginning of the month. I would show my dad, and at first he would say, "Oh, maybe our cousins are just pranking you," or "It's probably your friends." But every time I would ask my friends or cousins, they would give me this confused response, saying they never sent me any letters. Now that I'm in my 4th year at university, the letters don't come as frequently. But 2 weeks ago, something happened that makes me think things are escalating. I came back home from university at 7:45 p.m., and it was fairly dark outside. I saw that my mailbox flag was up, so I checked the mail, and it was mostly just bills. At this point, I haven't gotten a note for a little over 3 months now, so I'm thinking maybe the notes won't come anymore. As I settle in for bed, I change into my pajamas and check the locks as usual. As I checked my front door lock, I looked out the glass panel of my door, and I saw that the red flag of my mailbox is up again. It's 10:30 at night. No way the mail could have gotten dropped off, and plus I had just checked it. I call my dad and tell him about it, and he said not to freak out, that maybe one of our neighbors accidentally got some of our mail and just dropped it off since this happens frequently. I stay on the phone with my dad as I quickly run down my driveway to check the mailbox. As I open the mailbox, I feel my heart drop because it's an unmarked manila envelope. I quickly run back inside and open the manila envelope, and although there's no written note, I find something more disturbing. It's a pair of my old blue panties that I haven't seen in years. At this point I scream, and my dad tells me to hang up and call my aunt, who's a police officer. My aunt comes over and checks the inside and outside of my house, but she can't find anything. She tries to jog my memory and asks if I know anyone who could be doing this, but I honestly have no clue. My aunt told me to keep any more letters I get, and she's been staying with me the days my dad is out for work. My dad is thinking about installing security cameras, and hopefully we can catch whoever it is that way. But what else can I do? I'm paranoid because I don't know who this person is, but I know he's been stalking me for a long time. Those panties he sent me were ones I had while I was in high school, and I lost that pair while I was in grade 10. The fear of the unknown is getting to me so much that my anxiety is not letting me function normally. I just don't know what to do. This all happened yesterday, and I'm writing this on my phone from our hotel room, so please forgive my grammatical errors. Here we go. Fort Bragg, California is a small beach town northwest of Sacramento. It has a kind of Stephen King vibe to it. You know what I mean. That misty, almost eerie, small harbor town. But it's beautiful, and a huge tourist attraction. You get people from all over the US that travel here. My fiancé and I decided to drive up here after I had to take some time off work due to stress. It was a last-minute decision, and we packed up our bags in less than 10 minutes, grabbed our dog, and took off. If we wouldn't have had our dog with us, I'm pretty sure I would have lost her. I guess this is where I tell the story, right? It's our second day here right now, and we're staying in a motel that overlooks the ocean. You can see the fog roll in during the early hours of the morning, and watch the fishing boats leave the harbor to go get their haul for the day. It really is a beautiful thing to see. I woke up early, and I was craving, and I mean craving, eggs and bacon. After getting dressed and deciding what spot to stuff our faces at, we left on our morning adventure. See, here's where I made my mistake. I was driving down the road, and it looked like the stop we crawled up to was a 4-way stop sign. I clearly guessed wrong, because when I pulled out and cut off a small Ford Ranger with a dinky trailer attached to it and 2 old men driving, I realized I was a little too late and that I had cut them off. They threw up their hands and pointed at me, but Lily didn't even notice. I threw up my hands in a sorry I'm just a dipshit tourist kind of way, and they just stared me down. It was a hillbilly standoff that George Strait would be proud of. I didn't think much of it, and kept driving down the foggy 2-lane road to get breakfast. I didn't even say anything to her about it. I never thought I'd see them again, and I didn't want her to complain about me not knowing how to drive. I was wrong, though. I was wrong, and I'll never forget what happened next. We got back to the motel after a not-so-great but overly expensive breakfast. We cuddled up and talked about our plans for the wedding, what we wanted to do after the wedding, and midway through our life plans, she realized that we were out of dog food to feed Bruce. I agreed to going up to the cute but creepy market and grabbing a bag of goodies, kissed her on the cheek, and jumped in the Navy. We call her Navigator Navi. I left and got about halfway to the store before I realized that I had forgotten my wallet on the nightstand. When I pulled back into the parking lot, I saw it. That same Ford Ranger with the janky trailer attached to it. The only difference was that Hank and Boomhauer weren't inside of it. I don't remember seeing them here last night, I thought. I walked up to our door while looking over my shoulder, wondering, what are the chances these douchebags are staying here? Not 2 seconds later, my heart started to beat faster. Our motel door was open, but barely cracked. It was open slightly to the point where you could see a sliver of light, but nothing more. I pushed it open and looked inside, but I didn't see anything. Lily and Bruce were both gone. It was like they were never really there at all. My heart started racing, and I dropped my keys on the floor and ran outside, heart pounding in my chest faster than a jackhammer in New York. I didn't see the creepy old guys from the Ford truck or my fiancé outside. I was becoming angry and frantic by this point. Fuck, where are you guys? I thought, before screaming inside my head was cut off by the sound of familiar barking. I heard Bruce barking and I ran. I ran faster than I ever have in my 28 years of life. I ran straight over to the front office where the sound was coming from, and that's when I saw her and our dog inside the office. She was crying, sitting on the floor sobbing uncontrollably, and his hair was standing straight up, until he saw that it was me sprinting towards them. Lily got up and ran into my arms. Meanwhile, the clerk is on the phone, and I'm wondering, what the hell happened in the 2 minutes I was gone? This is what happened, told by her, and it makes my blood run cold. As soon as I left, not 30 seconds went by when those guys knocked on the door. Lily opened it up thinking it was me forgetting something, which I had, and they tried to force their way into the room. One of them said, "You can thank your boy toy for what's coming to you," while grabbing her and covering her mouth. But these assholes didn't realize one thing. That's that we had a dog in our back seat when I cut them off. Bruce jumped off the bed and didn't hesitate to bite the one grabbing her. They kicked at him and tried to shake him off, but he wouldn't let go. After being bit and realizing that the noise would draw attention if they didn't leave, they ran off and Lily was able to run to the front office and wait for help. Bruce followed suit. I wasn't there. I couldn't protect her. If we would have found a dog sitter, she could be gone right now. But my dog was there, and he did exactly what a good boy, no, the best boy would do. And for that, he is truly my best friend. If he wasn't there, what would have happened? Would she have been kidnapped? Beaten? Killed? The craziest thing is that they haven't been caught yet. We filed all the reports with the local sheriff. I told them what had happened earlier that morning, and the cop looked right at me and said, "You're lucky your dog was there. If he wasn't, and they got in there with her, you could have been filing a different report right now." I got tears in my eyes at that. I looked over at Lily and Bruce and thanked God that I rescued him from the pound, because in return he rescued the love of my life when I couldn't. The only information we had from the sheriff after about a week is that the truck was not owned by the people that committed the crime. Also, after going down to the sheriff's station, we couldn't identify the man they arrested. They didn't look anything like the two guys I had seen and that Lily had come in contact with. Right now, they're out there, somewhere, hiding or acting like nothing happened. We're back home in Sacramento, and Bruce as well as Lily are both safe. If I hear anything else, I'll update you all again.
I used to go to summer camp every summer back when I was younger. This was in the late 79s or so, maybe early to mid 80s. That was the peak of summer camp related horror movies, but I guess that's not really important. Except to let you know that we used to do those campfires and gather around to tell scary stories by them. This is also something that happened during my last time at this particular camp. There was a bit of a strange incident that occurred when I was there, and afterwards my parents didn't want me to ever go back. Now, I'm not going to say exactly where this happened. I will let you know that the camp is still there, though. I just checked out of curiosity, actually. I don't want to get into any legal issues or trouble with them or anything. I was 14 years old at the time this happened. There were several boy cabins and girl cabins. Generally, one of each would be paired up to do things together. So, one night, the girl cabin that we were paired up with were out sitting by the campfire and roasting marshmallows. One of the counselors, who was 17 years old if I remember correctly, decided to ask us if we had any scary stories to share around the fire. For the life of me, I can't remember that many details of the stories. I do recall that most of them were fairly lame, but I guess that was to have been expected. Plus, funnily enough, one or two of the campers even tried to rip off famous horror movies in their story. I didn't realize this at the time, but looking back, I think the reason he did this was actually because he knew the other kids would all tell really lame stories, so when it finally came around to tell his, it would seem extra terrifying. All I really remember about the story that the counselor told, though, is that it was a fairly typical campfire story. It just so happened to take place at this very camp many years ago. It involved a camper who was bullied by older kids, bullied so much he got fed up and lost his mind or whatever. After that, he killed so many so-and-so other campers and counselors before disappearing into the woods, never to be seen again. He was never caught and still lives out there waiting for campers to come so he can kill them once more. It was fairly standard trite stuff. While he was telling the story, though, we began to hear some weird, creepy noises away from the fire. Some of the younger kids were scared by the noises. The older ones like me, though, pretty much figured that it was another counselor trying to scare us. And that was pretty typical of the way these campfire tales would go anyway. I could tell looking at the younger kids that several of them were really scared. I might have been mildly so, but I knew what was going on. So, the counselor, after getting to the end of the story, began noticing those sounds coming out from the woods. Turning back to us, he put on the cheesiest look and asked us if we heard the spooky noises. Of course, most of the younger kids told them they had. One of them even braved to ask if he thought it was the camper who had disappeared so many years ago. The counselor told the kid it was probably nothing, but he thought that he should go out into the woods to find out what was going on. One of the younger kids begged him not to go, thinking something bad would be waiting out there for him, but he assured her that he would be all right. He told me I was in charge until he got back. Then he got up and crept off into the woods. Now, I hadn't been told anything about a prank. I thought if he had left me in charge, he might have at least let me in on the joke, but I had to brace myself for whatever was going to happen anyway. I tried to pay attention to the noises out in the woods, but a lot of the younger kids started to get worried and kept asking me questions about if that counselor was all right. They even asked me when he would be coming back. Because I was paying so much attention to them, I really couldn't tell where he might have gone. I was worried that with my guard down, I was going to be just as scared as them when he actually came back. We waited, but there was nothing happening while we did so. There were no noises that seemed out of place, no people that we saw or heard out in the woods. But worst of all, we kept waiting, and the counselor did not come back. Now, I think just about everyone was beginning to get a bit scared. The younger kids thought the killer camper had gotten to him. I still thought we were being set up for an eventual scare. But regardless of what, everyone seemed to be a bit apprehensive of something. Well, even more time passed by, and I could no longer justify waiting there. I began to get worried as well. I sent one of the 13-year-old campers over to one of the cabins to get another counselor. They came back with Steve, who was 18 and a typical big jock. He was actually the person I had foremost assumed might have been helping our counselor with his little prank. I decided to explain to Steve what had happened. Turned out he was not aware of anyone pranking us, so he got worried too. He went and got another counselor and grabbed some flashlights for all of us. They had me stay with the kids from my group while they went out and searched for our counselor. I took the kids all back to their cabins and told them to lock the doors up tight. I was going to go back to the fire and wait to see when the guys got back. Luckily, the girls' counselor was still in her cabin, so she was there to watch the girls. The boys, though, really didn't want me to leave. They seemed a lot more scared than the girls were actually. I don't know exactly how much time had passed. I didn't have a watch, but I knew it had been quite a long time since our counselor had gone out there. I even heard Steve and the other counselor calling out for him quite loudly. And then I started to feel really scared. Now, after a while, I began seeing lights headed in my direction. I was relieved. I immediately thought that Steve and the other counselor must have found the guy. When only the two of them emerged from the woods, though, I felt a sort of weird jolt in my system. They hadn't found him. I went with them to the camp director. He had already gone to bed, but we let him know about the emergency situation going on. He got in touch with the park rangers, as I went back to the cabin to tell the boys to try and get some sleep. In the end, my counselor never came back that night. The rangers searched all over for him. Adults came and formed search parties to look for him. Many people came and searched for him in those vast woods, but no one ever found him. I don't know what happened. The official story was that he was a runaway. Apparently, he didn't have the happiest home life and did have some abuse issues with his parents. Of course, though, that's not what most campers believed. Not myself, but it seemed they believed that the camper who had disappeared into the woods so long ago came back, heard the counselor telling his story, and killed him, then hid the body somewhere that could never be found. I don't quite believe that, but I do wish I could just know what happened to him. One time when I was at summer camp, I had a really terrifying experience. I was 13 years old at the time, if I remember correctly. I'm not sure how long we had been at camp at this point, but it was a month-long trip. I'm going to guess it was sometime near the middle of it. The cabin that I stayed in was off to the far side of the camp. Right about 50 feet away from there was this fire pit. On some nights, we would roast hot dogs or marshmallows or something by the fire. People would gather around and tell scary stories. But we weren't really allowed to tell anything too scary because some campers were too easily scared. When we went to bed that night, we had just come in from sitting at the campfire. Our counselor did not sleep in the cabin with us. There was a separate cabin for both the male and female counselors. He waited until everyone was lying down in bed, and at least pretending to be asleep before he left. I assumed he was walking to the counselor's cabin. I couldn't sleep though. Mostly because some of the other boys weren't sleeping and they were talking to or whispering with each other. I think most of us had drifted off before I did though. There was a top bunk with a window that was looking out over towards the fire. I laid there, not able to sleep, just watching the fire burn. After a little while of staring, I was very surprised to see someone walk up from what looked like the river. I watched as he walked right up to the fire and then sat down beside it. At first, I assumed it was one of the counselors, but it made no sense for them to be coming from that direction. Still, I didn't think anything too unusual was going on yet. After another little while, though, I saw another person walk up to the fire. This person was coming from the camp. They walked up to the fire, but they didn't sit down. I was wondering exactly what was going on there. It didn't take long until I watched the first guy immediately leap onto his feet. He approached the second man, and I watched the second guy back off a little. It only took a moment or two before I noticed a struggle break out amongst the two men. It was not easy to make them out at all, just shadows up against the fire, but they were definitely fighting. I had no idea what to do or even if I should do anything, but then I heard one of the guys calling out the specific name of one of the counselors. It was only a few moments before a couple other people ran into the picture. It was a very obvious struggle. I don't know exactly why I did this, but I jumped off my bunk and ran outside immediately. There were at least 3 other counselors over there. I doubt they desperately needed my help or anything, but I had watched the whole thing unfold and wanted to see it closer at hand. Well, just when I got close enough to make the people out, the worst happened. The man who had been sitting by the fire pulled out a knife, and I watched as he stabbed one of the 3 counselors. I stopped in my tracks, wasting no time turning around, and ran back to the counselor's cabin. There were some other counselors in there. I told them that a person had just been stabbed by someone down at the fire. They told me to remain still in the cabin as they went down there to check it out. I did. I was too terrified to go back out a second time. I just waited and waited, scared to death about what was going on. Finally, after what seemed like forever, a few of the counselors came back to the cabin. They had come with a police officer as well. Thankfully, we weren't that far from civilization where it wouldn't have made any sense that they could get there so quickly. I had to talk to the officer and tell him exactly what I had seen. They asked if I could describe anything about the man who had done the stabbing, but unfortunately, I had never really gotten a good look at him. Apparently, some hermit had been camping out in a canoe or something. He was the one who had come up to the fire. I guess the counselor had gone out to see what was going on, and the hermit just attacked him. After the stabbing, the hermit had gotten back into his canoe and fled while the counselors tried to help the wounded one. It was really scary, especially thinking about how this dangerous hermit was still being at large. I actually wondered if they would close down the camp because of it. You know, like people suggest all the time in horror movies, but no one ever listens. Nothing like that happened, though. No one figured the guy was any real sort of danger, because it was unlikely he would come back to the camp for fear of being caught. We finished up the last couple weeks of camp with no further incident. I'm not sure if that hermit was ever caught. If he was, we were never told about it. It sure added to the scary atmosphere of the camp being out by the fire, though. Nothing happened, though, for the rest of the time, and when camp was over, we all just went home. I guess that's how these sorts of things end in real life. I had been going to summer camp every year for as far back as I can remember. When I was 16, I stopped being just a camper though and became a counselor myself. It was pretty cool to not only be responsible for a bunch of kids, but also being able to bend the rules a whole lot easier too. When I was 18, right after graduating high school, I went to what I assumed would be my very last time at that camp. I was going off to college in the fall, and I just thought that meant that this part of my life would be far behind me. I knew most of the other counselors, as they had been going to the camp for just as long as I had been. Plenty of them were going off to college too. So, we tried to have as much a fun time that summer as we could, seeing as how it might be the last time we could do it together. One night, about a week into camp, we had done a hot dog roast by the campfire. After putting all of the younger kids to bed, all of the counselors went back to the fire to hang out. One of the guys had gotten us some beer, so we kept by the fire drinking and talking, and telling each other scary stories as well. Of course, back then, it didn't take very much beer to get us buzzed. We were all 18 years old after all. After hanging out by the fire sometime after midnight, a bunch of us decided to go skinny dipping in the lake. It was a very dumb idea, I know, but when you're young and buzzed out like that, you tend to make some stupid decisions. Of course, horny 18-year-olds tend to like going skinny dipping as well. So we all went down to a certain part of the lake. We wanted to make sure we were far enough away from the camp that if any of the kids got up, they wouldn't come upon a bunch of naked 18-year-olds in the water. I was super out of it at the time. Everything I'm going to share will be seen through the lens of a very drunk person. We were all playing around, just having a nice time. There was this rock that wasn't too high, but it overlooked the water. We took turns jumping off of it into the water. Now, on about the third time I jumped off the rock, the strangest thing happened. I jumped off and went down deep into the water. However, on the way up, I felt two things immediately. Something seemed like it had just grabbed my leg, and suddenly I stopped going upward. I looked down into the water, but that was pretty pointless. Even with my eyes a little bit adjusted, I couldn't see anything in that dark water. But although I couldn't see what was holding my leg, it was very clearly something keeping me from resurfacing. It only took mere moments before I began to struggle and panic a lot. I kept flailing my arms, kicking my legs as best as I could. When I jumped, I hadn't intended on being underwater for so long, so I didn't have any breath saved up either. Holding my breath was becoming impossible, and I accidentally sucked some water in when I couldn't hold it back anymore. At first, it felt really painful. I began struggling more and took in more water, but I couldn't get loose from whatever was holding my leg. After an extremely long moment of terror, everything blacked out. I woke up very confused on the side of the lake. I was spitting out water, but unsure what was happening around me. After that, I remained on the ground, looking over at everyone as I was trying to figure out what had just happened. When I started getting my faculties back, I realized that I must have just drowned. Apparently, the other counselors were very concerned when I didn't resurface. They all came and pulled me out of the water. They were very confused, though, about why I hadn't come back up. I remembered something had grabbed my leg. I told them all about it, but they seemed really doubtful. They told me nothing was holding me down when they'd pulled me out of the lake. They thought I must have imagined all of it when I inhaled the water and started hallucinating. But I know that I didn't. Something grabbed me under the water. I have no idea what it was, but I remember it very clearly. I'm a great diver and swimmer, so there's no reason I would have just not resurfaced unless something was holding me down there. To this day, people don't believe me when I tell this story, but I just want to reiterate, it really did happen. I never went swimming in that lake again, and in the end, I never found out what it was that grabbed me. A few years ago, I worked at a Jewish summer camp in North Georgia. As many of you might know, Georgia is a fairly conservative state, as well as being predominantly Christian. There are some small Jewish communities and a few summer camps as well. I'd say this camp was more culturally Jewish than it was religious. There were no religious requirements nor any religion-specific focus. Rather, it was just a place for kids who were often in the minority to come to a camp that allowed them to meet other kids just like them. The staff came from all over as well. We had many Australians, lots of Brits, a few Israelis, and many people from various areas of the USA. Each night at around 10, most of the staff was able to go out on the town for a couple of hours. Enough staff remained behind to watch over the cabins, though. We rotated every now and then. This particular night, a group of about 5 of us decided to go to a local bar to grab a few beers. It had been a really hot day, and it was also a humid night, so we decided to sit outside on the patio. For some backstory in the town, generally we were extremely well received by the community, despite some differences. We brought in a lot of revenue for the town during the summer, actually. We bought supplies at the local Wal-Mart, and often took the campers on tubing trips, or occasionally out to dinner after a long hike on the Appalachian Trail. It was midsummer, so we had been out to the bars in the area many times already that session. The 5 of us all sat around a table, drinking and happily discussing the events of the day, as fellow employees typically would after work. About 30 minutes in, though, this white man in his 20s walks right up to our table. I distinctly remember a jagged scar on his cheek, but I didn't think much of it at the time. He introduced himself and told us he was having a party that night at his place. "Anyone can come," he said. "Black, white, gay, straight." I found it odd that he'd open his speech with that sort of disclaimer. Of course a party should be open to everyone. Why did he feel a need to specify? But we'd all had a few beers and were feeling pretty loose. We talked in a friendly manner for a bit longer and nothing seemed too off. We told him we were working at a camp in the area and couldn't stay out late, so we'd need to be heading back soon. An hour later, our group went out to the parking lot to get into the car. As we approached it, we saw the same man emerge from the shadows. He had a buddy with him with a shaved head, and his expression was incredibly hateful. His eyes had changed completely. He pounded his fist into his hand, then took off his shirt and revealed a poorly inked SS tattoo. My stomach dropped. One of the bigger guys in the group, Kevin, immediately reacted by pulling a knife out of his back pocket and asked what they wanted. The original guy started shouting some anti-Semitic remarks and told us he was going to beat us all down. Kevin started walking toward the 2 men, but we pulled him back just in time. He'd told his buddies we were on the way. Sure enough, some more guys started walking into the parking lot from every direction. It kinda gets all blurry here. I remember jumping into one of the cars and pulling Kevin with us. It felt like we were completely surrounded, though in reality there were probably only 7 or 8 people there. They threw rocks and all sorts of things at our car as we sped off. My heart was beating like crazy. We never went back to that bar either. On the bright side, when we told the story to the competitor bar in town, the bartender lined up 6 shots, cheersed us, and said we'd always be welcome there. Had no more problems in the town itself. But when I took some campers on a 2-day hike up the Appalachian Trail, that was a scary story for another time.
It all started over a year ago, living in my current small neighborhood. It was unusually hot in our house for October, and my sister figured it'd be a good idea to keep her window open for a bit of air. She was doing her homework, and I was getting ready for bed, when suddenly she bursts into my room. She frantically says she heard some noises outside, the sounds of leaves crunching under a person's steps. I believed it to be an animal, so I walked into her room and stayed there for not more than 5 minutes, until I heard the leaves crunching as well. We glanced out the window, only to hear the sound of something running away into the woods. But that wouldn't be the end of this story. During the winter, I enjoyed exploring the woods towards the back of my home, climbing trees and traveling further back to the fields. I remembered the events very clearly. It had just snowed that night, the first snowfall of winter, and I was more than excited to head out there. I did so and climbed my usual tree to have a look out. I gave a cursory glance around me and at the ground when I noticed something strange. Footsteps leading away from our house. This wouldn't be weird as long as the front of the footsteps didn't end pointing straight at my house, and the origin of them came from a seemingly long-off start. I tracked them down up to a point where there was a rusty wire fence covered in snow, where they suddenly disappeared. In October of 2017, it started up again. I was laying in my bed, pitch dark, not a light shining through my room, when I heard it. My doorknob turning, and my door creaking open. My heart stopped. Every single possibility of what it was rushing through my head. Keep in mind, my door is always shut when I go to sleep. Since I was covered by my blanket, I quickly shot my sister a text. "Did you just come in my room?" She replied with a sharp, "No, I'm all the way in Hilliard." My heart began pumping fast. I slowly snuck my hand under my pillow and grabbed my baton. I sent a text to my dad and waited. My dad came in mere minutes later with a knife, shot on the lights, and I jumped out of bed. We searched the entire house but found nothing. The alarm was set, and all the doors were locked. Impossible. There's no way that happened otherwise. My dad and mom were asleep, and a cat would have opened it much faster if it jumped at the doorknob. You best believe I didn't sleep a second that night. Fast forward to December. My relatives in town were staying for a week in the basement. We turned on the alarm, and all headed to sleep. I stayed up gaming. In the morning, at around 2:30 or 3, estimated since I wasn't aware of what had transpired, my uncle slowly opened his eyes. He told me he had a feeling of being watched. His eyes adjusted a bit to the dark before he saw it. A man with average height, scrawny with his hair flowing in the wind and shivering, looking inside their room through the window. My uncle screamed and they grabbed their baby before taking off upstairs. That morning I was informed what had happened. I looked for footprints and saw only the smallest sign. A front toe print made from what I could only assume was a sneaker. My uncle gave me more details without me telling him I had looked for footprints, and he said the man was leaning to the left looking in. The footprint matched his story. The left side had a thin line of dirt. Anyone could have shimmied across. Now that leads to tonight. The night I could swear he or whatever it was had been in our house. I couldn't sleep. Life had been pretty stressful lately, and I was pretty much up all night until I tried getting rest. Every night I've had a string of Christmas lights dimly light up the room until tonight. I figured the lights must have been interfering with my sleep, so I unplugged them and headed off to bed. Pillow over my head, I started to drift off until it happened. A quick strum of my guitar and the sound of something falling over with a desperate attempt to stop it from hitting the ground filled the room. The sound ignited my heart rate, saliva developing at extreme speed. It was hard not to swallow. I could feel the presence of someone in my room. Realizing I left my baton on my desk, I did the next logical thing, to pretend I was asleep. I tried and laid there for what felt like hours. In reality, it was only a few minutes, till I heard a whimper come from my sister's room. Imagining this may be the horrible day everyone in my family but me was silently murdered, I gathered up all the courage I had. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and grabbed my baton. I busted into my sister's room and screamed, only to see that she was unharmed. My sister asked me what the hell I was doing, and I just stood there looking into the pitch black of my room and cried. I've never in my life felt the overwhelming emotion of believing my family was going to be taken from me until today. I sit here in my chair writing this in hopes to document my experiences and try to come up with some kind of logical conclusion. All I can come up with is that there's some man stalking my family and perhaps sneaking into our rooms at night. When I turned 18, I figured it'd be best to move out on my own. It isn't like I had family problems or anything like that. I really just wanted to start my life as an adult. I'd often daydream about throwing crazy parties, being able to hook up without having to find a spot, always having beer in the fridge, and basically just having a ridiculous amount of freedom. So, the summer after high school, I found this small apartment complex on the south side of town. It wasn't anything fancy. 5 apartments to a floor, 3 floors per building, and 7 buildings spaced out along a horseshoe-shaped road, with some woodland surrounding it. My apartment wasn't very big. Being fresh out of high school, and working a low-end job as a waiter, I could only score a small studio apartment. I was fortunate enough to snag one on the 3rd floor, so I didn't have any upstairs neighbors. I planned on going to college, but as some people know, things don't always work out that way. After the fall semester had started and I hadn't enrolled, I started doing double shifts at work to keep myself busy. Living alone in a studio apartment can really take a mental toll on you. Seriously, it can. Sitting around all day doing absolutely nothing, waiting to go to work, can get really old after a while. Not to mention most of my friends ran off to schools out of state, and I was the one left behind. I'm not throwing a pity party for myself. I'm just saying that's how the situation was. Anyway, I'd work these doubles all day. They were roughly 10-hour shifts, depending on how busy the restaurant was. I'd come back home super late at night, way past when the sun had gone down. I had to walk through the giant horseshoe back to my apartment that sat all the way on the other end. At that point in time, I realized college was out of reach for me, so I started saving all my money for a new car. I kept most of my tip money in a large box under my bed, and when I'd come home, I'd pull it out, throw the money in, and then go to sleep. Well, that was always my intention. The problem is, since I'd be working so much, and being just a kid, I always wanted to try and get in some personal time by watching television, playing video games, or just throwing on one of my favorite movies. I'd usually be able to stay up all night doing it, crush about 4 hours of sleep, then wake up, rinse, and repeat. After so long, I couldn't do this anymore. Mainly because I had to cancel my cable in order to pay rent, as well as pawn off my gaming system and DVD player. It really sucked for me. Movies and television had been my life. I wanted to go to school to study them, but being an adult always has its costs. Still, even if I had nothing to do, I couldn't stay asleep. I'd stay up all night, smoking a ridiculous amount of cigarettes, and just stare out my window in the middle of the night. Where I'm from, some crazy lightning storms pass through from time to time, especially in the late summer or early fall. I just watched those all the time. Having nothing to do really opened my eyes to my surroundings. I'd watch the lights on the other apartments go out. I knew my neighbor's bedtime, which sounds sinister, but I'd never act on anything like that. I knew all the people who liked to get a late-night smoke in. I knew how many people liked to drive over to the Taco Bell past midnight in order to get a late-night snack. I also knew that the entire complex became a ghost town at around 2 in the morning. There'd be absolutely nothing going on. It'd just be me, either staring out my window or smoking on my balcony. One night, I decided to take a walk. I did laps around the horseshoe and was listening to an old iPod shuffle. I remember it being a rather cool night, and I wore an old hoodie with the hood up. I probably looked extremely suspicious, but honestly, I was just out for a walk. I followed this massive iron fence that wrapped around the entire complex. I was heading back home when I came across something really weird. It was a gate. It led off into the woods that surrounded the complex. I found it rather weird. I mean, the place was gated, but to have this weird gate on the side of the complex was odd. Not to mention it led absolutely nowhere. It gave me chills to see that the gate was open. I stared off into the darkness of the surrounding woodlands, hoping to see if anybody was out there, or maybe if someone just forgot to shut it. I don't know. I kept moving. Luckily, I could see the gate from my apartment, and I decided I had a new game to play. Who opens the gate? After coming home from work, I placed my tips in my box, went to my window and stared out and looked for the gate. I could see it from my apartment. It was just really hard to notice. There weren't any streetlights around the damn thing, and it honestly looked like it wasn't even there. The gate was shut, and when it was shut, it blended into the fence perfectly. Nobody could know it was there unless they found the thing open, which I had. I didn't bother to tell anybody because, well, I didn't think it was a big deal. To be honest, I thought someone was going out there to smoke a bowl or fill some weird public sex fantasy or something. I didn't really care what was going on behind there, but I needed something to do to pass my late night hours. So I'm sitting on my balcony, and it's way past 2 a.m. at this point. I'm the only thing awake in the complex as far as I'm concerned, and I'm just smoking away on a pack of Times. I'm starting to get tired, and I figured I'd call it a night, when I heard the squeaking sound of the iron gate. The metal sounded rusted, and it was rather loud from what I remember, but this was all a long time ago. I lowered myself down, trying to hide myself amongst the shadows of my balcony. I didn't want to spook whoever was going into the trees. I squinted my eyes, trying to get a good picture. I could see a shadow moving along the darkness of the tree line, but I soon realized that whoever it was wasn't coming from the apartment complex. They were coming in. My first thought was that it was a person who maybe worked on the other side of the forest and had used a shortcut to get through. I'd never seen it happen before, but maybe I'd just discovered a new routine of one of my neighbors. I thought that, until my eyes adjusted properly to the darkness around the gate. Whoever came from those trees wasn't a person that lived in my complex. They were physically handicapped, I think. They hunched their back a bit. Their arms swayed back and forth, dangling like they were lifeless. The knees of the person were bent low to the ground, lower than I could possibly imagine someone getting and still being able to walk. The movement of their body was just haunting, I guess is the right word. The sight of it alone stopped my heart. I couldn't tell the gender of the person, but they did have medium-length hair that covered a portion of their face. The person moved away from the gate, flailing around in a disturbing manner. They were mumbling to themselves, loud enough that I could hear it. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but to be honest, it just sounded like a bunch of gibberish. I figured whoever this was extremely disturbed. I held my breath as I watched the person move from behind the building across from mine, towards the one right next to it. They stayed away from the streetlights that lined the horseshoe-shaped drive. They moved through the shadows, as if trying to avoid being detected. I didn't move an inch. I just watched as they started to make their way to a building. As it made its way towards the front of the building, it looked over its shoulder, and in doing so they looked right at me. I don't know how they saw me, but I know that they did. They were pretty far away and it was dark, but I swear to God I saw their eyes widen, and then they scurried off into the darkness. They didn't stand, they didn't change anything about their posture. In that weird low walk they entered with, they rushed off faster than most people could run. I blinked a few times because I couldn't believe it at first, but then I heard the gate slam shut, and I knew it really did fucking happen. I didn't sleep at all that night. I felt like shit the next morning, and had to call in for the morning part of my work shift. I wasn't able to sleep until early afternoon after the sun came up, and finally went to work. I ended up having to stay late because one of my tables stuck around after we closed, just to have a few more drinks with the manager who they were friends with. I scored a $50 tip out of it alone, so I wasn't complaining. When I got home, I went to stash my money in my box. I opened it up, and inside all of my cash remained, but a note read in some of the worst handwriting I'd ever seen. "I saw you watching me." My heart stopped. How the fuck did they know my room number? How did they get in? I freaked out and started wondering if they might still be around. Being a studio apartment, they didn't have a lot of places to hide, so I checked under my bed, in the closet, and in my bathroom. They were long gone. I took a peek out my window and saw the gate closed. However, the brush of the woodland swayed back and forth, as if someone was moving about within. I freaked and called the police. It took them a bit to get there, and when they did, it seemed like the whole complex came alive. All the lights came on, and everyone came out to see what the disturbance was. When I told the officers what had happened, they made me feel like I was an idiot. They didn't believe me at all. I told them where the gate was. I was too freaked out to go down there and show them myself. When they went to look, sure enough, the gate was there. The two went searching for the person, while two more stayed back to take my statement on the whole matter. When the two cops came back, they didn't seem to want to talk about it at first, but they were as pale as ghosts. When one of the officers that stayed back to take my statement pressed them, they finally opened up. They said they didn't find anybody, but they did find a bunch of personal items hung up in various trees around the forest. They thought it was weird, and they began asking all my neighbors if they were missing anything. Sure enough, people in the buildings that lined the damn iron fence where the gate stood were missing all sorts of things, but they weren't anything of value. Pictures inside of frames, a hairbrush, some books, things like that. They were odd things for someone to just steal. The people of the complex were creeped the hell out. I mean, I saw at least 5 moving trucks the next week. People just wanted to get out of there, and I didn't blame them. The owners of the complex came in and sealed the gate shut using a blowtorch. Turns out, they had no idea it was even there in the first place. They didn't put it in. I got out of Dodge when I had the chance. I didn't do my nightly routines anymore, but I sure as hell still couldn't sleep. I left all my lights on, and my electricity bill was getting a bit on the high side because of it. I couldn't afford to live in the place much longer anyway. I moved back to the north side of town, in a cheaper complex that wasn't surrounded by woodland. I still have nightmares about the whole ordeal, and I often wonder who the hell that person was, and what they wanted with all the random stuff they stole. It still freaks me out that they just wandered off into the woods, and I never saw them again. So before I begin, perhaps a bit of background information would help you understand my story. I'm a 20-year-old male, living in the Netherlands, and I've been a geek all my life. Games in particular have always played a major role in my life, starting when I got my first PlayStation when I was 5 years old. Something about gaming just always got me, be it mechanically or in terms of storytelling. I could always find something to love about it. As I grew older, I started to get more and more into RPGs, and eventually found my way onto World of Warcraft. As I got more involved in the game, I started joining raiding guilds. For those of you who don't know, it's basically a group of players who intend to face the game's hardest content as a team. The second guild I joined was the greatest bloody team of people I had met thus far. One of those people was a Swedish girl who was around my age. She was named Maggie. We got along nicely. As it turned out, her mom, who was also in this guild, was actually living in the Netherlands, so we'd often end up in conversations where she asked me to teach her some Dutch, and she'd teach me some Swedish in return. It was all good fun. Fast forward to the beginning of 2013. The aforementioned guild had fallen apart a while back, and I had joined a new one. I stayed in touch with some people in the old guild, but Maggie really hadn't been online all that much. When she did get back online, we quickly caught up. It turned out she had actually moved in with her mother and had been spending the last couple of months improving her Dutch and attending a high school. She also started dating this guy called William, who was actually part of the same guild I had met Maggie in. He always struck me as a nice guy. Other guild members always thought he was a bit too direct and perhaps rude, but being Dutch, I understood that was just simply how our culture worked, so I was always okay with it. June comes around. Me and Maggie recently finished our final exams, and we're waiting for the results to come back in. One afternoon while we were playing online, I suggested a meetup between the two of us. I really didn't have much to do, and given that she had voiced her concerns about finding her footing in Dutch social circles, I figured this was a nice opportunity to take our first baby steps into the country. She excitedly agreed and asked if she could bring William as well. Obviously, I said yes, seeing as he was her boyfriend. Meetups are safer when you arrive as a couple, and meeting former guild members was something I was looking forward to anyway. A couple of days later, I met both of them in Rotterdam, and we all had a great day. I showed them around the city since I knew it best. We had some nice conversations, a few laughs, and we ended the day by taking a trip to the Euromast. Before leaving, Maggie had to go to the bathroom, so me and William were waiting outside together. Striking a conversation, I said to him, "You two make for a nice couple." "Thanks," he replied. I freaking love her, you know. Honestly wouldn't know what to do without her at this stage. Back then, I didn't think much of that statement. It was just a thing people say when they're in love, so kudos to him, right? Maggie got out of the restroom, and we said our goodbyes and we parted ways. A few weeks later, we got our exam scores back. I had passed high school with flying colors, but Maggie wasn't so lucky. She had failed most of her exams. She told me she was going to be studying for the rest of the summer in order to properly prepare for her rerun of the last year of high school. I told her that if she needed any help, that I was willing to see what I could do, even when I was going to college. She was very thankful, and assured me that she'd let me know if she needed any help. Fast forward again to September. After our last conversation, Maggie had practically disappeared off of the internet. She hadn't logged into World of Warcraft. She was never on Skype and wasn't even online on Facebook anymore. I had asked William in mid-August how she was doing, and he assured me she was fine, so I thought nothing of it. I even admired her focus on her education. However, during my second week in college, all of that changed. I got into the metro and picked up a free newspaper in the seat next to me, just to pass the time. I vividly remember turning to the fourth page to read a headline saying, "Swedish woman, 19, from city, stabbed in own backyard." It took me a few seconds to even realize that she lived in that city now, and that she was 19. Even though the article didn't mention a name, I began to grow very concerned. I quickly sent her a text message, as we'd exchanged phone numbers when we met up. I wanted to ask her if she was okay. The rest of the day went by, and I heard nothing from her. I eventually figured that if anything had happened to her, people would likely start posting things on her Facebook page. Concerned and scared of what I was going to find, I started typing her name into the search bar for Facebook. Sure enough, it was already filling with messages from people who had heard she had passed away from her injuries. After inquiring with some of the other former guild members, it turned out William had stabbed her. She had broken up with him after she had gotten her horrendous test results back, and he wasn't all too pleased with that. In the aftermath of the incident, me and some other Dutch guild members went to her city to meet up with her friends from school. We attended the memorial set up in her school and put some flowers at the scene of the crime on behalf of everyone she had played the game with. When we met up with Maggie's school friends, we found out William hadn't been half as nice as we all thought he was. During the relationship, he had been very controlling of Maggie, and after the breakup, he began stalking her and sending her threatening messages. She even went to the police to report it, but they told her they couldn't do anything for her at that stage. After that, she met a different guy and started dating him. William found out and, well, he took matters into his own hands. thinking back at this, the worst part of this all just came to mind. When we put flowers at the scene of the crime, we stood around for a few minutes. We didn't know whether or not we should knock on the door and personally give her mother our condolences, given that she was our friend as well. We decided against it, given that we might unintentionally remind her that Maggie's online connections were what ultimately cost her her life. As soon as we got back to our car, I saw Maggie's front door open. Out of the door came her mother, with Maggie's younger sister. I knew at the time that Maggie had a younger sister, but I didn't know that she was only 6 or 7. I lost it when I saw her little head hanging down while grabbing hold of her mother, scared to go around the corner to face all of the drawings and flowers people had left there. In writing this post, I found a recent article that said William would be going to prison for 20 years most likely. Honestly, I hope he never makes it out of there. In 2008, a routine visit to my friend's farm changed the way I lived my life, a life full of paranoia and suspicion. As a preface, I'd like to clarify I was never in any harm. The antagonist of this story went on to be a registered sex offender around last year. I am Jonas. I was born in 1996 and befriended a lifelong friend in preschool named Sammy. This friendship years later would test through a traumatic event in our lives. On the 4th of June, 2008, around 7 days before my birthday, I visited my best friend at his farm. This had become routine over the years, because I rarely ever get to see him as he lived 2 hours away from me. His parents had left for a dinner date with mine. Unfortunately, he had no gaming consoles, back then when the GameCube was the shit, and only had a trampoline and a Game Boy Color with Pokemon. Of course, I was enthralled by this. Time passes and it's around 9:30 p.m. He darts off to the bathroom, but frankly, I didn't pay attention. I was lying down with the Game Boy Color being suspended over my head. I proceeded to adjust myself so I was sitting with my knees up and my back against the bed's backboard. As I transitioned seating positions, I glanced into the opposing cupboard doors, which were inbuilt, to see a red object quickly pass by the crack in the door. Unfortunately, my best friend wore a red onesie, because we were hard cunts, so I thought nothing of it, and assumed he crawled to the cupboards while I was so intently focused on the game. For some reason, now that I think about it, this red figure was almost 5'10", and we were both a measly 5'4", but this didn't budge my focus. I became tired of the 4-hour Pokemon binge, so I placed the Game Boy Color down and cracked my neck. As I roll my neck to the side, I focus on the crack and start to make out distinctive facial features. Thick eyebrows and wide nostrils, nothing like my friend. But then I heard something that would cause me to be on the verge of a breakdown in tears. I could hear my best friend in the bathroom, brushing his teeth. I was paralyzed. I didn't want to make obvious my immediate panicked state. I picked up the Game Boy and started to pretend to play it, at times glancing to the stream of light through the crack of the cupboard door. My friend runs in and startles me. My heart races as I see he isn't heading towards the bed. He's sliding along the cupboard doors. When he gets to the crack, a hand reaches out and grabs him and drags him in. All I can hear is his screams of terror and unrelenting kicks opening the cupboard doors and revealing a ginger boy in his late teens, who was 17 at the time. He had his arms wrapped around my friend's neck, trying to choke him. I panicked and started to cry. All I could do was muster a measly throw of the Game Boy Color. It managed to hit the boy in the side of his head, and he collapsed with a gasp of pain. Clearly dazed and confused, he stumbled out of the room, and I heard him fall down the stairs. The big wooden door of the house's entry slammed shut. I ran to my friend who was crying and in desperate need for a hand, so I helped him up. He was shocked and hyperventilating, so I did what any 12-year-old would do. I cried with him, loudly. We didn't know the phone numbers of our parents, and we had never called the police before, so it never crossed our minds at the time. Later, when our parents arrived, I bolted down the stairs and ran to my dad and hugged him. Meanwhile, my friend remained upstairs crying. They called the police immediately, as on their way back they had seen someone running through their farm. The following week, we found out it was the neighbor who lived in the farm over. He had intended to steal some game cartridges for our Game Boy Color, but had gotten there just as I had arrived, so he waited for around 6 hours in the cupboard, watching us and waiting for us to move. In 2014, he molested a 6-year-old child and flashed himself to a group of 14-year-old girls at a party he had crashed. When I look back and remember his face, he honestly looked like he intended to kill or badly injure my friend. There was something about his dark, empty eyes. He never confessed to anything other than breaking and entering and assault. He was let off with a restraining order, and never bothered either of us since.
I'm a 19-year-old French student. This happened last week. I was heading to my apartment after just seeing a friend. I took the tramway at 11:30 p.m. because I didn't feel comfortable walking alone at night. As soon as I sat down, a man who was already sitting nearby came and sat right in front of me. Immediately, I got a very strange vibe about him, so I told my boyfriend by chat. Then, I stood up to get off the tram once we arrived at my stop, but the man quickly got out after me. He was weirdly following me, not exactly walking behind me, but next to me to the side. I was getting very anxious, knowing that something was wrong about this situation. Still, though, I continued to walk to the avenue I live in. I crossed the road towards my abode, and he did not, so I thought at first it was okay. A few seconds later, though, after a slight delay, he crossed the road too, and started walking behind me. He passed me by at some point, walking slightly in front of me. I thought at this point that maybe I was just being paranoid. Maybe he really was just walking this way too. As we neared my building, though, he stopped and waited until I met up with him. At this point, he turned around and asked me if I had a boyfriend and all that sort of thing. I answered immediately. Yeah, sorry, good evening," as polite as can be. He proceeded to leave in front of me, so I was walking a bit slower for him to get farther and farther away. I wanted to make sure he didn't know I was almost home. Once I felt he was far enough away, I turned into the little pathway leading to the lobby of my building. I was still feeling anxious about this man, though, even as I watched him continue to walk away. I thought I had put my keys into my pocket, but it turned out they were still in my bag. I was shaking so much that it took me multiple attempts to grab them. Finally, though, I managed to get them and open the magnetic door. I thought of closing the door immediately after me, just in case the man still wanted to follow me. The door was closed, but the magnetic system hadn't quite clicked on yet. I saw the man begin running towards me immediately. He pushed on the door violently, with these horrific eyes looking at me. The door was made of clear glass, so I totally saw his expression. That's when I knew this was real trouble. Without even thinking, I screamed as loud as I could. I think that's what saved my life. The man immediately opened the door and ran to me. He shoved me hard onto the ground and started to choke me. I was too stunned because I hadn't been prepared for such a violent, direct assault. He was choking me so hard I couldn't even scream or breathe, and nobody was coming to help. I really thought I was going to die right there, looking into his bulging eyes, gazing directly into mine, with pure hate. I'm a very small size, so I really wasn't able to do anything with my arms at all. I think in real time it wasn't that long, but it felt like an eternity, and I even lost consciousness for a moment. When I opened my eyes again, he had just started running away. I saw the caretaker's wife kneeling beside me. The caretaker was chasing after the man, but did not manage to catch him in the end. He came back and called the police, though, who caught the man within 10 minutes of the events thanks to our description. I really don't know why he did that to me, because when he attacked me, he didn't sexually assault me or even rob me, which would have been really easy. I can't understand. It seems like his only goal was to kill me. I'll never be thankful enough to my caretaker who came to help me and saved my life, because nobody else in the building called the police or even tried to help. The man was judged 3 days later and is in jail now. He denied everything, even though the caretaker and I identified him directly, and there are video proofs of him following me too. I'm a 14-year-old female. This happened to me about 2 months ago when my family and I went to visit my uncles and aunts who live up north. Every time we visit my family, me and my siblings stay for a bit longer than our parents. One of our uncles usually drops us off back home. After maybe 5 or 6 days, my parents had already left to get back to work. This meant it was me, my sister, and my cousins, and their family, of course. I've always had this habit of bike riding around the neighborhood since this town is pretty hilly and the roads are fun to go down. To give a little background of this place, it's quite a small city. People know each other very well, and it's really green around here. Naturally, the weather stays quite pleasant as well. So, I, as always, took my cousin's bike and went out for a ride. Usually I like to do a full tour around the neighborhood, but this time I felt like I was old enough to go a bit further away and explore the outside. Big mistake. I set out and headed down this narrow street between the hills. It wasn't too far away from my house, but if you cycle your way there, it takes about 45 minutes or so. It was kind of breezy out and my hair was open. It felt like the best thing ever to feel it flowing through. Stepping out of my main character feeling moment, I realized I'd been out for about an hour now and it was close to 6:30. The sun would be setting very soon, and I had to get back before it got dark. The hills were in the most secluded part of town, so barely any people came around that way. The roads were also not in the best shape, so I decided to go a little bit slower in order to avoid injuring myself. Well, about 10 minutes later, I spot this white, old Corolla drive slowly past me. I paid no heed to it at first and continued on my way home. Only a minute later, though, it drives right past me again, and again, and again, for 4 more times. At this point, I was starting to get very concerned since the sun was already setting, and I could easily tell I would not make it home before it got dark. On top of that, that weird car kept passing by me. I picked up my speed while doing my best to avoid the small pointy rocks that could easily flatten my tires. My cousin owns those old-style bikes with tube tires that you need to pump once a month. A couple of minutes later, the car comes back, but this time it pulls up right in front of me. Hurriedly, I slam on my brakes as to not slam into the car. As I regain my balance, I shout angrily at the driver, "Yo, are you fucking blind or what?" No response. The car door opens, and this man, easily 6 feet or more, I'd say in his late 20s and built as fuck, steps out of the car. In the most polite tone I've probably ever heard, he says, "Sorry, I wasn't looking." I shrugged my shoulders and picked my bike up and started heading back home. It was already dark out now, and I didn't want to stay on this empty road with a strange man, especially while he was in a car and I was only on a bike. I started heading forward when he called out to me, "I could drop you off at home, you know." I curtly rejected him and got on my bike. "It's okay, you can come, I'm alone today anyway," he says, getting louder. I reply no and keep on moving. He didn't say anything after and just hopped in his car. I took a big breath of relief and started moving forward, thinking about how creepy this dude was. Just as I was about to take the turn for the main road, which was thankfully full of people, this man yelled again, "You're gonna be tired, baby. You've been cycling for so long." I looked back at him with a puzzled face. He's still following me? I shot him a "what the fuck do you think you're doing" kinda look. At this point, he fully stopped his car and hopped out all the way. He started sprinting towards me. By now, I was freaking the fuck out of myself because I had no idea what this man wanted with me. I tried to increase my speed and flee away before he could reach me. Unfortunately for me though, somehow this man managed to channel Usain Bolt and ran so fast that he caught up with me. He grabbed my shoulder, causing me to lose my balance. I tried to stop my bike and yell at him at full volume to hopefully attract some attention. He actually stopped for a moment, but the next minute he grabbed me by the arms and started dragging me off my bike. At this point I was full on screaming for a single person to come help me. But looking around, no one really cared enough to pay attention, so I just continued my futile struggling. After putting up a fight for another minute or so, I completely lost my balance and my bike fell out from under me. In a second, the man picked me up and started dragging me away to the car. I was too angry or scared, I don't even know, but my adrenaline kicked in full force. I kicked the man in his ankle. His nuts were too far away for my legs to reach. Because of this, he kind of lost his balance and wobbled about a bit. I took the opportunity, stood up and elbowed him as hard as I could in his chest. He looked shocked for a second, but then went in for my arms again. At this point, I started running. I left my bike to die for God's sake, and made my best run for it. Thankfully, the man didn't follow me, and I didn't stop to check if he was either. I reached home about 30 minutes later or something, drenched in sweat and panting like a dog. My aunt yelled at me for coming home so late, and how they were worried sick. I didn't tell them what happened. I just made up a story about how I lost the bike and had to walk all the way home. Later that night, I told my sister the entire thing though, and she convinced me to call our mother and tell her everything. My mom talked to my uncles and aunts, and they all decided to keep it down and not tell the police, since it would be next to impossible to find the man now. He might have already left even in fear of getting caught. At the time this happened, I was a 23-year-old female, and also a student. I was living alone in a small apartment complex not too far away from my school. I've never really liked living alone. I was also quite afraid of the dark. However, I always felt safe in my little apartment. It only had one way to get in, and you needed to unlock 2 doors to get inside, the main front door to the building and the door to my apartment. I also used to have a few lights on even at night, and my laptop was usually playing some movie until I fell asleep. I always remembered to lock my door too, except for this one time. One weekend, I was out drinking with my friends. When I was going back home, I ended up sharing a taxi with some random guy who happened to be going to the same area as me. We both jumped out of the taxi outside my place and talked for a little bit. It turned out he was about the same age as me, and he also happened to be a student as well. He walked me to my front door, we said goodnight, and I went inside. Some weeks, maybe a month or so later, I decided to stay home for the weekend. I was just watching some series in my bed until I fell asleep, when suddenly I was awoken by a voice. I couldn't really hear what the voice was saying, but I could hear that it was definitely a man talking. I shot my eyes open, and I saw a shadow standing in the doorway of my bedroom. I froze, and my adrenaline started pumping. I couldn't even find the courage to scream. I just kept staring at that figure. He stopped talking at that point, and I quietly asked, "Who are you?" He took a step closer and whispered into my ear, "Don't you remember me?" He was very clearly drunk, but I suddenly realized it was the exact same guy I'd shared a taxi with some weeks ago. At first, I felt some weird feeling of relief that I recognized him, but at the same time, I was completely horrified. I didn't want to provoke him, so I asked him very calmly what he was doing here. "I was just thinking about you. I turned off your lights and closed your laptop." He smiled. I kept staring at him, still in my bed. I asked him how the hell he'd gotten into my building. He said he'd been ringing my doorbell, but I didn't open. So he tried all my neighbors until someone opened up for him. He also went into my neighbor's apartment at first, but realized it wasn't mine. Then he saw my name on one of the doors and went in. I think he could see the fear in my eyes at that point. I think I should go." He stumbled out, and I went out right after him. Before I could catch him, though, he turned around and said, "You know, you should really lock your door." I shut the door in his face and locked it immediately after. I went back to bed and cried. I couldn't sleep for the rest of the night. I never called the police, but I did tell my friends the next day. The following months, someone would ring my doorbell every now and then in the middle of the night, and I would get an anxiety attack every time. I never opened it up, but I had the feeling it was definitely him. I never saw the guy in person again, though. I'm relieved that nothing else happened that night. And from that day forward, I always double-checked that I had the doors locked. I also removed my name from the door, too. So after crying just a little bit after looking at crime scenes on the internet, I think it's about time to tell this story. It's just one of those moments when I randomly start thinking about it in a more serious mood than usual. It's gonna be a long one. This happened about 4 months ago now. Maybe a bit more, but I can't really say for sure. Anyway, I was 19 years old. I've turned 20 since then in mid-February. I was going home from university after class. Usually I take my keys with me, but around that time I had lost them, and my mom had yet to make me a new copy. I remember I kept insisting she do so, but she just kept forgetting. So what I'd do was knock on the door to get my younger brother's attention so he'd come and let me in. My mom also took away his keys though and just left him there locked up as well. I asked my brother to pass me my charger from my room and called one of my aunties to see if I could go hang out at her workplace in the meantime. She said yes, then told me to call an Uber that she'd be paying for as soon as I got there. So that's what I did. Now, the Uber didn't pick me up exactly at home. It was at the house across the street instead. I don't know if there was a special reason for it. The guy just decided to do so. The moment I saw the guy, he immediately gave me kind of a weird vibe. I also know, though, that I tend to get paranoid every time I so much as hop in a taxi, so I decided to just let it roll off me and got inside. I rolled down the window and kept a grip on both of my phones. At first, it seemed like a relatively normal ride, until we got to the area where my aunt's workplace was. It was a convenience store at her home in a housing complex. Instead of turning into it though, he completely drove right past it, claiming he was following the GPS. When I asked him about it though, he wouldn't let me see the coordinates he'd put in. He sure seemed to know exactly where he was going though. I was kind of doomed from the beginning, I realized, because I didn't know the directions to this place, and I could only rely on the driver being a good person and recognizing the area. I did so, but wherever he was taking me now, I had no idea. I remember seeing this fountain that I could recognize from when my mom drove to my uncle's place, but that was way further away than where we were supposed to be going. By now, I was kind of trying to think of what to do, because this guy had driven past a fuck ton of empty housings, and a couple of them even seemed to be still under construction. He stopped the car in this place that looked like the end of civilization. We were literally on a hill surrounded by nothing. He then turned off the car. I realize now that I got lucky in so many ways looking back on it. My phone had no credit, but as soon as I thought of that, my aunt called me and asked, "Where are you?" I literally felt my heart drop in my chest because I had no idea, and now the dude was dead staring at me. I told her honestly that I had no idea, and asked him out loud, "Hey, where did you take me?" He replied with a curt, "I don't know what to tell you, kid." That was enough for me. I grabbed my backpack and slammed the door open real quick, with a loud, "That's fine, I'll see myself out." I hauled ass immediately like I hadn't in a very long time. I remember even being afraid of carrying my backpack on my back in case he'd chase me and pull on it. I held it tight in my hand with my hoodie wrapped around my waist as I thought of a good place to hide. I thought of knocking on someone's door, but for some reason that didn't seem safe to me at the moment. I remember telling my aunt not to hang up too, because he was still following me in his car. At this point, I saw an empty barren surrounded by concrete walls and a strong barred gate. It appeared there was enough space under the gate to crawl in though, so I literally threw my backpack down and crawled under that hole. There was a huge electric control box, which I opened and crouched inside to hide in, my aunt still on the phone. She, my other aunt, and my uncle were all on the call with each other, putting credit onto my phone while asking for my live location through WhatsApp, since I had no idea where I was. It was literally the middle of nowhere. I waited for about 2 hours, while this guy kept circling and would not leave. I even had to go pee outside the box and immediately run back inside to hide. There were tons of tiny spiders and old honeycombs, so I was fighting both my arachnophobia and trypophobia as well. At some point, I'm guessing the guy eventually left, since my uncle got there in his truck. He couldn't tell where I was, so he had to keep honking and telling me to tell him when I could hear it closer. When I finally heard him nearby, I got out. For a while, I thought maybe this had just been a misunderstanding. Maybe I jumped out of some guy's car like a maniac without even paying him. But when I got home after staying at my aunt's place for a while, I checked my phone and the Uber app. Not only did it say I'd already paid, but it also said I'd made it safely to my destination, so I immediately ruled that out. I told my aunts not to tell my mom about this because she goes absolutely insane over the most minor inconvenience, so telling her this would not only freak her out, but she'd also be of no help at all. I only let her know when I called her to come get me, and on our way to get a copy of that key. Because of course, something bad had to happen until she actually listened to me. Nowadays, she always puts credit on my phone as well. Anyway, that's what went down. I had to Indiana Jones that shit twice, and to this day, my family brags about how I was able to keep myself perfectly composed and react quickly, which even I'm still shocked about. I remember seeing broken glass and metal bars laying around, and telling my aunt, if I'm going down, I'm taking him with me. On our way home, I remember my mom telling me I only wasn't in hysterics because I was in shock, and it had hit me the next day. It never did though. I kept going around as normal. But last week she brought it up again and asked if I didn't think I was gonna die at the time. I said of course I did, but I also knew freaking out would either only make me an easier target, or just not help me in any way. When I remember all of this, I feel more scared than angry really. Things really could have gone terribly wrong. My parents believed this guy was a rookie who maybe felt sorry for me and let me go in the end, because if he wanted to, he really could have hurt me with some sort of weapon, or just tried to kill me right then and there. I don't even know anymore. I sent his profile to all the girls I know, so that if they ever happen to get him as their Uber driver, they can cancel. Since then, I also don't take Ubers anymore.
I was maybe 22 years old, and taking the bus home in a major city. The bus was pretty packed, so I didn't think anything of it when some guy sat down in the empty seat next to me. He had long, kinda greasy black hair, and I could smell alcohol on him as soon as he sat down. He didn't look too much older than me, actually. I had my headphones in and was on my phone, but he immediately started talking to me. Hey, do you have an Instagram? I made a show of pulling out my earphones, hoping he'd get the hint that I was not looking to chat. I told him I didn't, which was a lie. Yes, you do. I can see the app right here, he says, and taps his finger on the very visible Instagram icon on the screen of my phone. I was immediately embarrassed that he'd caught me in such a bold-faced lie, and I blamed that feeling for the incredibly stupid way I proceeded to then handle him. He starts telling me to add him, explaining that he's a famous rapper and skateboarder, and insisting that I'd love his videos. He then tells me that I can look him up by his name, Taylor Swift. You mean like the singer? I asked him. He glares at me and just says, no, not like the singer. Okay then. Getting really freaked out, I tell him that I don't really go on Instagram much, but I'd look into adding him when I got home. Suddenly he just grabs my phone out of my hands and proceeds to open up my Instagram account to look himself up and add himself as my friend, all while continuing to rant about his rap career. At this point, I was genuinely worried that this guy was insane, and I was just trying to be as nice as possible in case he turned out to be violent. I'm sitting in the window seat, so he's blocking my ability to get up and move. Still, looking back, I wish I'd started some drama when he took my phone. He then hands my phone back to me and asks for my phone number. I stupidly, and too intimidated from getting caught in my last lie, decided to give him my real one. I then insisted that the upcoming stop was my own, which it wasn't, and exited the bus. For the next few weeks, this guy calls me and leaves voicemails of his terrible, nonsensical raps. I almost laughed them off, showing the voicemails to some of my friends and joking about how I met Taylor Swift, the rapper. He also keeps adding me to these weird group texts in which he asks if anyone wants to meet him where he's at, and then all the replies are from people saying things like, "Dude, I don't even know you, stop adding me to these group texts." Maybe a month or two after this encounter, my roommate comes home and tells me she has some big news. She works for a yoga studio, and one of her clients, another 20-something woman living in our neighborhood, approached her to warn her about a local creep that had been harassing a friend of hers. Apparently, this guy had fixated on her friend after meeting her randomly on the street and started stalking her. Her friend even had to get the police involved after this creep shoved a letter for her through the mail slot into her apartment. The letter was full of nonsense and threats to find her and hurt her. As I'm sure you've all guessed already, this weirdo referred to himself as Taylor Swift. Well, Mr. Swift was swiftly caught by the police a few days later. He turned out to be some homeless guy who really had legally changed his name to Taylor Swift. He also turned out to be in violation of his probation, as he was a convicted rapist who moved to our state without registering as a sex offender. After he was caught, the police raided his phone and found literally hundreds of photos he'd secretly taken of women around our neighborhood, many of whom were teenagers. He did some jail time for this in the end, but in the end he was released pretty quickly as well, because of his name and his apparent determination to continue being a fucking creep. I still see his exploits pop up in the news occasionally. Last I heard, he was stalking women in a city about an hour and a half away from me. I used to work at one of those 24/7 Wal-Mart supercenters. I was right out of high school, 19 and female, and worked as a cashier for 2 terrible years, where I was subjected to all kinds of abuse from customers and coworkers alike. I mean, I was screamed at, slammed into a register face first, groped, and even farted on once because this old lady was mad that oranges were priced each and not by the pound. I'm not kidding either. However, the time that sticks out in my head the most is the time a customer tried to follow me home. I had just started my shift, and the second I got on the register, I had a line about 10 people long. For some reason, the Walmart I worked at never had enough registers open, so people were usually really mad and impatient by the time they got to me. Still though, I get right to work and keep a smile plastered to my face while making the minimal mandatory small talk. "How are you? Did you find everything?" Most customers were very polite, but not all too interested in talking, so it was easy to fall into a bit of a cashier robot mode. I get to this one guy who only had 2 items, yogurt and some Band-Aids. I ring it all up in record time and neatly bag it up, but the customer doesn't seem to be paying any attention. He wouldn't look at me or answer my greeting. His eyes just stared right down at the conveyor belt. Maybe he was a bit zoned out. The conveyor belt didn't look too dirty. I hadn't had a chance to wash it yet because the second I'd walked over to the register, people lined up. Side note, always bag up your produce. Conveyor belts can get really nasty. I told the man his total, which was something like $4.36. He starts fishing in his pockets for exact change without looking up. Inwardly I groan, but I keep my customer service smile fixated into place while I wait. He's wearing one of those muddy brown denim jackets with lots of pockets, and as he rifles through, I keep catching whiffs of stale BO and cigarettes. His hands were pretty dirty too, and all dried out from the cold weather. He dumps out an assortment of change on the counter, still not looking at me, and I begin to count it up. Everything is uncomfortably quiet. I can feel the eyes of every customer waiting in line boring into me, all except the guy who was then digging into his pants pockets as well. He was about 30 cents short in the end. I let him know once I was sure he wasn't going to find any more coins. It was then that he looked at me, making this scrunched up face. His eyes were very dark brown, almost black, and they pierced right into me accusingly, as if he thought I was lying or something. While he was watching, I counted everything again. It's only 30 cents, come on, can't you just give me an employee discount? No, sir, that's against the rules, I answered apologetically. Do you want to put something back? I wasn't about to get fired for giving someone my discount, which was only 10% if you're wondering. He wasn't the first person to ask for it, but most people pretended they were joking at least. This guy was definitely not joking. No, I want them, he said, glaring at me. I was beginning to wish he'd start staring at the conveyor belt once again instead of at me. He was making me pretty uncomfortable. If I'd had 30 cents in my pocket, I would have just paid it up myself just to get this man to leave. He reached over to take the bag, but I turned the little bag carousel so that he couldn't. Probably a stupid move on my part, but it's not like I can just let him steal, right? If my register was short 30 cents, my supervisors would be all over me. I know you get a discount, just plug it in already. He completely blows up at this point, but I shake my head and look at the other customers, probably with a deer in headlights expression. People are all watching, but no one does anything. This is just something that's inconveniencing them, even though I'm actually pretty scared. I already started flashing my register light so that CSM would come, but they were notorious for taking their sweet time. I'll get a CSM, but it might take a few minutes, I nervously offer, but the man just goes off and goes on about how it's not that much, and he desperately needs it, with some explicit language thrown in as well, of course. He leaves in the end before the supervisor comes over, grabbing all of his change and shoving it all into one pocket before stomping off. I'm relieved that he's gone, and continue working in uneasy silence. Everything seemed to go normal after that. My shift ends at midnight, and I managed to clock out on time for once. I didn't have a car myself, and would normally call my mom to come pick me up, but this time she was out of town. It was too late to call anyone else, so I decided I'd rather walk than waste money on a cab. I lived about 20 minutes away, and felt pretty safe walking, because you didn't really tend to run into other pedestrians at that late an hour. After a few minutes of walking, though, I noticed a car was driving really slowly behind me. The speed limit was 45 miles per hour, and this car was probably going about 10. I got a bad gut feeling, and walked a little faster while trying to rationalize it away. It could have possibly been someone who wanted to offer me a ride or get directions, right? But no. Whoever it was stayed right behind me, and never tried to pull up next to me at all, even though they were going very slow. After about 5 minutes of this, the car finally turns off into one of the neighborhoods. I was relieved, but it was short-lived. The driver parks his car on the curb and gets out, then comes jogging right up to me. I realized immediately that it was that same yogurt/Band-Aid guy. He was wearing the exact same muddy brown jacket and was staring at me with those dark eyes. I turn around and start running down the sidewalk, which was still icy, but he just jogs up right next to me. I can actually still hear the change jingling in his pocket. He doesn't say anything at first, so I try to run faster without slipping. Had this guy been sitting in the parking lot for hours, waiting for me to get off work? Apparently so. I feel him staring at me, and turn my head to look at him, while still running as fast as I can on the ice. Inwardly, I thank my lucky stars that there was fresh gravel laid out, or I would have probably slipped like in a classic horror movie cliché. "What color is your underwear?" he asks. His question horrified and disgusted me, so my immediate reaction was, "Don't be a creep," and I punched him right in his face. It hurt my hand like a bitch, but he stopped running for a second and bent forward a bit, clutching his face. I swear I heard him say okay, but but I just kept running and was too scared to even look back. I'm not sure if he kept following me after that, but I didn't run straight home because I was scared of him figuring out where I lived. When I did make it home, probably an hour later, I went to my landlady's apartment first and told her what happened. I was really shaken up about this and told her that if she saw a suspicious guy around the building, she should call the police right away. My mom was out of town. I did still live with her at the time, and she didn't answer my calls, so I watched Disney movies until I was calm enough to go to sleep. The next day, I told the managers at work what happened, but surprise, surprise, they didn't care. In hindsight, I probably should have called the police, but I was young and thought that if it was necessary, management would have told me to do it. I don't really know why I thought that, considering they had a way of not really caring about their employees, and this sort of situation wouldn't exactly have made them look good. This wasn't the only Wal-Mart-related incident where police should have been called but weren't after all. I felt pretty angry that they didn't take me seriously, or care at all that I was scared. I wanted to go home early because I was scared the guy would show up again, but they told me no, and made me go work the registers anyway. I quit very shortly after that. I never did see the yogurt/Band-Aid guy again, but it's been about 10 years, and I'm not even sure if I'd recognize him if I did. Before the story, I would like to address that I'm from northern Norway. Also, I'm a female. When I was younger, I used to do speed skating, which is a form of ice skating where you practice to become as fast as possible. I had 2 coaches, and they're both pretty old. There are usually competitions at different locations, where you get to compete with someone else. I had been doing ice skating for about a year at the time, and we had been traveling a lot through the northern parts of Norway. We had actually even traveled to Russia as well for a competition. We once traveled to a small peninsula, which was located in the middle of nowhere. This little town contained about 2,000 people and a single hotel. It took about 5 hours to drive to this little town from my hometown. When we finally arrived, we settled into the hotel we had booked. For some reason, they had booked 2 rooms this time, one for them and one for me to be alone. At the time, all the others who used to practice ice skating with me had quit, or were not able or allowed to continue to travel so far. At first, having a hotel room for 2 for myself felt great. I had complete privacy and free time to do whatever I wanted. While I was at competitions and waiting for my turn to compete, I made a friend with a girl who we'll call Mary. Mary was sweet and kind, and she made the weekend I was spending in that town a little bit more fun. We were both the same age. We met later on the same day I'd met her, and hung out at her school where there was an arrangement. I figured it would be a good idea to bring her to the hotel and hang out as well. Honestly, it was a great idea. We watched a movie, ate some snacks, and had a lot of fun. Then at some point, though, was the inevitable time it came for her to leave. It was pretty late, around midnight when she left. I was a decent kid, so I followed her downstairs to the lobby to say goodbye. I was also intending on buying a bottle of soda while I was downstairs as well. Once she had left, I went to buy the soda at the counter that was close to the exit. There was a man standing behind the counter. He had an accent, so I figured he had moved to Norway from another country recently. He seemed very interested in me, and asked what I was doing in the lobby at such a late time. I told him I wanted to get a soda, and asked the price for the bottle as there was no price tag near. He told me that one bottle is about 40 NOK, which is about 5 USD. I decided I would not pay that much for a small bottle of soda, and said I would be heading back upstairs instead. Surprisingly, the guy instantly started begging me to stay downstairs and talk to him. This scared me a little bit, but I felt as if I had to stay for some reason. He asked me a lot of questions. He asked what my name is, where I was from, if my parents were here, who I was with. I honestly answered all of these, even though I felt threatened and unsafe. I knew not to trust strangers, but I've always had this thing for being nice to everyone. Eventually, I said I was tired and would go upstairs to catch some sleep. He tried to make me stay longer in the end, but I decided to leave anyway. A few moments later, before I had gone to sleep, I heard someone knocking on my door. I thought to myself that it might as well be one of my coaches who needed something from me, so I went to open it. It was not either of them, though. It was the guy from before. He was holding a lighter, and in a very broken accent, said he was looking for someone who had lost it. I told him it was not mine and immediately shut the door, but he put his foot in between the door and the wall on my side and asked to come in. I was scared as hell and started forcing the door shut. I remember very little about this part, except I can make out that I somehow managed to close the door and lock it. I immediately made a call to my mother, who called my coaches to tell them about the incident. I never saw the man again after that. When we got home, my mother made a call to the hotel manager and complained about the incident. The manager said that he will not charge the guy for what he did, and that he will not face any consequences, even though my mom kept telling him what the guy's intention likely was. I know it sounds ridiculous, but the guy probably still even works there to this day. I'm so confused about that whole incident, and incredibly happy that whatever did happen, I stopped him from getting in and going through with his terrible intentions. This story begins around the time of my junior year of high school. I was 15 years old, and in that phase of my life where I didn't listen to anyone, yet at the same time was completely impressionable. At the beginning of the year, I was sitting in my 6th period chem class, probably zoned out, looking at my phone under the clunky gray lab table, when I heard two people laughing to my right. The way the classroom was set up was a long rectangle, so essentially the teacher wouldn't really be able to hear what was going on in the back. The people laughing were a guy and a girl, Eric and Callie. They were somewhat popular, not the top of the food chain by any means, but someone everyone knew. My younger sister knew Eric. They had a tennis match a month or two earlier. He was really funny, and this is a crucial element to this story. He was definitely the class clown. He was tall, good-looking, and extremely charismatic. I wasn't attracted to him, but I could see why everyone else around was. I think it was at this point in time where I made one of the most regrettable decisions of my life. I decided I wanted to become friends with Eric. You see, Eric was in my 2nd, 5th, and 6th periods. The next morning, I poked him in the back in Spanish class. "Hey," I said, "I heard my sister kicked your ass in tennis." He turned around with a big goofy smile, his friends all looking at me. "Who's your sister?" His voice had a specific cadence to it. "Karen," I replied. I don't remember the rest of this encounter, but I'm pretty sure he denied losing the tennis match. I think the conversation ended shortly thereafter, and my day continued until I saw him in math class. Algebra 2 was one of those classes where the teacher would lecture for a while, give us homework, and then let us have the rest of the period to work on it so we wouldn't have to do it when we actually got home. I was looking at my paper, probably confused, when I heard a familiar voice. "Hey, girl." I looked up and saw Eric crouched to my desk on the floor. "What's up?" He started asking me about tennis, and once I said that I played, a huge smile spread across his face. I think this is when he latched on to me. He asked for my phone number, and I gave it to him. That day, in our next period, he introduced me to Callie. She was older and really intimidating. I had never met anyone like her, and I was beginning to get excited at the prospect of such new and interesting friends. That night, he kept texting me non-stop. He would ask me questions and then just reply, "ha ha 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 ha," to everything I said. I thought it was weird, but that was just his humor. After this day, he didn't leave my side. We spent most of the school day together, and then would be in constant contact after school as well. This was 2011, so we were mostly on Facebook or doing group phone calls with Callie and two other friends of mine who I had brought into the group, Sasha and Natalie. There were lots of red flags. Eric wanted me to hold hands with him at school and told everyone he'd taken my virginity. For some inexplicable reason, this wasn't something I got too mad about. I just thought it was weird. He would say these things like, "Your virginity belongs to me." I assumed it was part of his jokes. I always assumed Eric wasn't attracted to girls, because he said he wasn't, although he would have sex with them and tell everyone, making fun of them. We would walk down the hallway after fifth period, and he would stop for a group of freshman girls waiting for him to give them each a peck on the lips. One time we were walking to the bus, and there was a girl about 10 feet in front of us. She was cheating on her boyfriend, which I whispered to him, pointing her out. Yes, it was childish, but keep in mind this was high school and I was 15. He proceeded to run toward her, stop her, only to point at me and tell her what I had said. She came over and yelled at me, and he watched the whole time laughing. A few months into the friendship, I began sneaking out with Eric, bringing him alcohol from my dad's liquor cabinet. Eric was a heavy drinker, especially considering our age. This all came to a head when he asked Kelly and I to come over one night. His dad was in prison and his mom was in rehab, so he lived with his grandparents. We pulled up outside his house, and his car wasn't there. We waited for a while, and finally he sped into the neighborhood and stumbled out of the driver's side completely wasted. We followed him inside, and his grandparents weren't home. I don't know what I said, but the next thing I know, he just grabs a knife off the kitchen counter and charges at me. I took off running and made it into Callie's car, slamming the door shut and locking it. He stares at me through the window before bursting into laughter. My heart was racing, and my blood ran cold. Callie got into the car and we left. I don't know why I stuck around. It was like an abusive relationship almost. He told me he was the only guy who would ever find me attractive, but somehow it would turn into a joke, and I would just let it go. I believe the breaking point was when I heard about the baby squirrel. He found a live baby squirrel after school and brought it home. His grandparents said they didn't want it in the house, so he walked outside and tossed it into the retention pond before walking back in. I wasn't there for that, but hearing about it disgusted me. In algebra a few days later, he knocked my pen off my desk and called me a bitch. Look, Eric, I don't want to be friends with you anymore, I told him very firmly. Don't talk to me. His head snapped back, and he moved to the desk in front of mine. You won't be able to ignore me. He laughed. I know where to find you. I'm going away to college next year, I reminded him. You'll never be able to get away from me. Are you threatening me? Yes. I know this sounds like a cheesy horror movie, but that was our exchange word for word. The next week was endless phone calls, and him trying to get me to talk to him at school. At first, it was jovial when he thought I was going to change my mind. Then he came up to me in math class and opened his backpack. Inside, there were several large kitchen knives. I should have told the teacher at that point. I really should have. But it wasn't until a few days later when he pushed me too far. I'm going to rape you, then murder you, and I'll make Natalie film it. I went to the dean's office and told them everything. I had grown up being told not to snitch, but I couldn't focus in class anymore. I had been a good kid this entire time. I'd never been in trouble, so they believed what I told them right away. Here's the kicker. They called him into the office, and he admitted to everything. Nodding, smiling, confirming all the stories I'd told them. Dean Thomas sat me down the next day and told me I needed to call the police. He said that there was something clearly wrong with him and that Eric just didn't get it. They put a school version of a restraining order on him. He wasn't to talk to me, and during tests he had to be taken to a separate classroom. He would do everything he could to get around these rules. He would talk about me right in front of my face, but wasn't technically talking to me. He said out loud to the class, "Some girl put a restraining order on me because she thinks I'm dangerous." The teacher laughed and said, "Doesn't she know you're joking? That that's just you being Eric?" The backlash I faced was enormous. All of his groupies shunned me and laughed at me. Even my own friends said I was overreacting, except for Natalie. She was always intuitive. She said he made her feel uncomfortable from the start and had started following her from class to class. When his birthday came, he approached me with Callie, and Callie said, "He wants you to wish him a happy birthday." Eventually, a mutual friend called me and told me Eric had threatened to kill himself if I wouldn't talk to him again. I went back to the dean's office, and this time every dean, vice principal, and even the principal got involved as well. My school was big, and there were 550 kids in my class. The school year ended, and without the protection of the authorities there, I was fielding more phone calls. When I blocked his number, he would just call me on Callie's phone. He would drive around my neighborhood just to see if my car was in the driveway. He even came to my tennis matches, the ones we'd initially bonded over. I could see his silhouette in the fence, watching me. By senior year, things had calmed down. His attention was finally elsewhere, and I had picked my classes specifically with the dean to ensure we weren't in any together. He was still watching, though. I would be walking down the hallway with someone he didn't know, and all of a sudden he would be walking with us, next to my unassuming friend. "Hi, I'm Eric. Nice to meet you." He told my friends he had decided to wait for me because we were soulmates, and I'd come around eventually. I graduated high school and moved out of town. I told my new college friends that if something ever happened to me, he was the one who did it. And that's all. There's no conclusion, really, except he always knows when I come into town. I don't know how because I have him blocked on everything. I suspect he still checks my house. He's been arrested since on drug charges and a few DUIs. I'm looking at his mugshots as I write this, to remember those dead eyes. Sometimes I wonder if I really did overreact. Maybe this was all just some sick joke. I'm posting from my phone, so apologies for weird formatting or bad grammar. When I was 18, I was living in a small town. I was friends with the ratty skaters around, and they helped connect with this dude who sold weed. He was 29 at the time, and gave me pretty good deals and lived nearby. I wasn't driving at the time, so this was very convenient for me. His name was Max. Max always struck me as a weird dude, but honestly, I quite liked his weirdness. Not in a romantic way or anything, but I just like weird people. We had normal weed-buying interactions that never lasted more than 10 minutes. Buy some weed, maybe smoke a bowl. That's it. He'd often tell me he could drop it off at my house, but I never let him because, as I said before, he was very weird. I wasn't afraid of him, but I was definitely aware that he and his offers to deliver were quite strange. One day in May 2018, I was invited to a bonfire by the same ratty skaters that first introduced me to this guy. I had no idea he'd be there, nor was it very important to me at all. I brought the guy I was dating at the time. I said hey to everyone, including Max. We stayed for a couple of hours, and some of them played music on their guitars. Nearing the time I was leaving the bonfire around 11 p.m., Max was getting upset about something and threw his guitar into the bonfire. I didn't know what he was so angry or upset about, and I paid it no mind. This happened as I was leaving with the guy I was dating. I went to bed and woke up to paragraphs on paragraphs of crazy text from Max, ranging from 1 a.m. to 5 a.m. A constant stream, stating things such as, "You know how much I loved you. You're a cruel cunt." He would go back and forth between saying, "I would give you the world if you'd let me," and "You really do deserve him, though." He said really scary things like, "You're a predator, and you should be snubbed out. Just wait." And, "You're stuck. I'll either love you or hate you to the fullest extent my powers behold. Right now I pay the worst death on you, and that fuckboy bitch." On top of it all, he said, "Losing you is like losing a mother to me." He told me to tell him I never loved him, and that I wouldn't hear from him again if I did. So that's what I did. I said, "I never loved you. Don't ever message me again," and left it at that. I didn't get a response, nor did I care to receive one. Max had never expressed any romantic interest or asked me out or anything. This was all out of nowhere, and he was 11 years older than me. I was just barely 18. That night, he cut his long hair off and posted photos naked on Facebook, curled up in a fetal position talking about being a statue of shame. It's as if he had a breakdown, but I had no intention of causing that, and didn't think I would even offend anyone by bringing the guy I was seeing. Everyone else seemed to like the guy I'd brought. About a week later, Max texted me pretty late at night and asked if I had seen the flowers he'd spread alongside my walk, saying that he stole every flower in the vicinity of my neighborhood that night. I asked him how he knew where I lived, and said I hadn't seen the flowers, so he must have had the wrong house. I also told him he shouldn't do that, as I never felt anything for him, and so on. He told me he'd heard that I lived on the same block as another one of the skater guys we were both friends with, and he wasn't wrong. The skater guy I lived by was on the other side of the block, and I never walked that way, so I never ended up seeing the flowers. I blocked his number, and didn't hear from him again for weeks. Weeks later, I woke up after a rough night, and there were loads of flowers on the sidewalk right outside my house, along with a little bouquet at the top of my walkway. I was pissed. I wasn't scared yet, and stupidly I unblocked his number and texted him asking why the fuck there were so many flowers outside my house. This confirmed that this indeed was where I lived. I still to this day feel so stupid for texting him and making it known that after weeks he had finally found my house. He responded saying, sounds nice. 'Twas me. I bitched him out basically and blocked his number again. About a week later, I was out of town, and my roommate texted me a photo of a heart with a peace sign inside of it, and my name written under it drawn in chalk outside our house. When I got back into town, I went to the courthouse and began the process of getting a stalking order against him. When I left the courthouse, I went to Max's work and told him he needed to stop this behavior, that he was stalking me. He looked at me in the eyes with no facial expression and said, "If you don't leave, I'm calling the cops." I got angry and yelled, "Call the cops, I was just talking to them about you." I left his work in a rage. Soon after this, I began driving. Once I drove by him and he noticed it was me. The next day I woke up with my car covered in flowers. I presented my case to the judge, and she put the stalking order in place. He was served with it by police officers, and I thought that was that. I thought he wouldn't be bothering me again. I was wrong. After the stalking order was served, he made several other chalk messages on my sidewalk. He would leave random gifts for me like chalk, and beheaded My Little Pony heads on beer bottles. I always brought these things to the police station, but they said I needed to catch him doing it, take a photo or get a security camera. So I got a camera. I really hoped I would catch him. It turned out my security camera was stupid, and I couldn't just watch the videos it took, but had to skip through second by hand. It was an impossible task. I was terrified of leaving my house at night at this point. I never had my curtains open anymore, and I was so frustrated that my livelihood was being taken away from me. Ultimately, I unblocked his number, in hopes that he would text me directly, which would violate the stalking order. After a few days, it worked. He sent me a weird text saying something like, "Forgive me, we're charming, this is harming, let us try again." By now it was September 2019, and he finally goes to jail. He's facing up to a year in jail, and has to stay there until our court date. I finally start calming down. I'm able to go outside at night, even if just to get in my car. I let myself have my curtain open sometimes. I was starting to feel alive again. Right when I start feeling secure in my small-town life again, someone posted bail. He was released after only 3 months in jail, and I went back to living in fear. We still had court dates coming up, and I was optimistic that he would serve more time for ruining my life for so long. His lawyer kept pushing the court date back to gather evidence, and after about 6 months of pushing it back, the state decided he wouldn't do anything more and closed the case basically. I had moved out of town 3 hours plus away at this point, so he didn't actually have an option to continue this behavior. Living in this new place, I feel safe. I can walk at night and don't have to close my curtains all the time. It's been over a year since they decided to close the case. About a month ago, he began responding to my friends' Instagram stories, friends that live here in this new town, telling them how fond he is of me. I've always had him blocked, but my Instagram isn't private, so he must have found them that way. I've since changed my account to private, and he hasn't messaged any more friends of mine. I refuse to be fearful now the way I was then. He'll never find where I live or where I work now. However, my life is forever changed by this experience. I will always be more aware of people and their weird energy. I'll always close my curtains early in the evening and make sure all the windows and doors are locked. I'll always live in a little bit of fear. Maybe not of him, but of it happening again. He ruined my life for a year, and I truly wish he had gotten that time in jail. He deserves it. About 15 years ago, I lived in Sulphur, Oklahoma. My playground? The Chickasaw National Recreation Area. I loved that park so much. I rode more miles on my bike than anywhere else. I walked nearly every trail and rode every road. Every day I would ride my mountain bike up and down the trails and would be home by nightfall most days. One night, however, I rode out a bit further than usual. On my way back, I decided to ride the trail from an area known as Buffalo Springs, where they have live buffalo roam. There's a large spring/fountain there for all to enjoy. As I was riding back, I knew the end of the trail was coming up, and I would have to cross a stone bridge across the creek, then up the road to my home. It was completely dark at this time, and all I had to use to see was the full moon. I was maybe a few hundred yards from it, when I suddenly got a sharp pain in my left thigh. I stopped and looked around to see what had just hit me. Then I heard a noise sounding like something hitting the ground hard in front of me. There was a rock about the size of a baseball rolling across the trail. I was confused. I started to look up the side of this hill. Just as I turned my head to look, I almost fall off my bike when another rock comes flying down and hits my front wheel. I finally adjust my eyes to look and see someone very tall and dark, covered in hair at the top of the hill, throwing things at me and screaming. I yelled at a cell phone and was going to call the police. I didn't actually have one, as I didn't have a cell phone yet. This seemed to only piss him off even more. He started charging down the hill at me. I, for obvious reasons, lit up the bike and took off. Just as I crossed the bridge, I heard splashing noises in the creek and saw that it was a large rock that had been thrown. I was in the clear to home, but I was frightened all the way there. I went up to the ranger station later the next morning and told the ranger I knew about what happened. "So you were attacked by Bigfoot?" He snidely laughed. "I don't know what it was, but something was trying to hurt me out there." "Okay, Justin. If I have any more Bigfoots, I'll let you know what we get." I just said fine and left. The next week I was riding in the daylight when PR pulled up next to me and told me to get in. I asked why. He said he needed to show me something. We headed to the police department in town. Before we get out of the car, he turns to me and says, "Justin, I have to give you a huge apology. I'll be honest that I didn't believe you when you told me that story of you being attacked. But it's come to my attention that another couple was out in the same area last night, and they were attacked in the same way. They said they saw a large hairy creature throwing rocks and sticks. They called the police, and they came out with some of the other rangers, including myself. And I immediately thought about what you had told me. When we arrived, we started up the hill. Sure enough, we were having rocks and things thrown at us. Guns drawn and yelling, 2 officers tackled a man to the ground. He was 6'5" tall, naked and covered in mud. He had long hair and a large beard. Turned out he had escaped from the Veterans Center across Veterans Lake. Apparently he thought he was back in Vietnam and was trying to take out the enemy. PR said I was very lucky because he was genuinely trying to kill me. We went inside so I could give the police my statement as to what had happened. They had him sent to a more secure facility somewhere else. To this day, I still get the shivers when I hike that trail, and I always keep my eyes on the ridge on top. I had gotten out of an 8-year abusive relationship and met someone on a popular online dating app. And to be honest, I wasn't looking for anything serious. just someone to go watch a movie or have a drink with every now and then. I had 2 boys and was happy and living a peaceful life on my own after going through hell. So I meet this guy who's a couple years older than me, and he had turned his life around. When he was younger, he used to be in gangs and drugs, and now he was into working out and staying really fit, doing all sorts of family stuff. I guess you can say I felt protected by him. He was a hard worker, self-sufficient. He had a son and loved going to the gym every day. I myself had kind of a crazy past, but overcame it, so we seemed like a good fit. We would go to dinner, movies, normal dating stuff, but he eventually wanted to spend more and more time together, and I was having trouble giving up all my free time for him. He would get really angry about this, like really angry. After being with a controlling, possessive asshole for so long, this was obviously a red flag, and after 3 months I told him that I didn't want to see him anymore. He said that he needed to confess something to me. He admitted to me that he was using steroids, and that was the reason for his mood swings. He cried and said he was sure that was the reason, and was willing to stop if it meant he could have another chance. I obliged, but only under the condition that we remain friends. Things were okay for a while. We saw each other maybe every other week, and he started wanting to see me every week. I told him that I was not interested in being anything other than friends at the moment, since I wasn't ready for a relationship. He tried to talk me into giving him another chance, but I just didn't find myself interested in him in a romantic way, so I insisted that we just keep being friends. I stopped talking to him eventually because I got mad at his insistence on talking every day, since he said that's what friends do. He would always ask my whereabouts and ask for pictures of who I was hanging out with. I had to tell him that's not what friends do. He just insisted that he innocently wanted to see what I was up to. Fast forward 6 months later, and I hadn't spoken to him at all within all of that time. I was happy and living my life, and on one particular night when my youngest son was at his dad's, I went out to a local bar with friends. My oldest son, who was 13 at the time, was home alone, so I left a little early to make it home around 10 p.m. I lay down in bed and go to sleep. So a little info on my living situation. I had been living in my condo for almost a year now, and we lived in a great, safe community. I would leave my patio sliding glass door open, screen closed, to get a breeze at night. No biggie. The bedroom was close to the patio, and my son would sleep in the loft that was closest to the front door. I was dead asleep when I suddenly felt someone slowly sit down on my bed. I was laying in bed wondering why my son would come sit in my bed so slowly. He wouldn't. I turn around and it's not him. It's Mario, not his real name, laying down in bed next to me. I sit up and ask him how the hell he got in. He's not answering me. He just says, "I need to talk to you." Okay, when you need to talk to someone, you don't sneak into someone's room. You call them, leave a note for them, literally anything but this. I was thinking I was going to kill my kid for letting him in. "I didn't have your number anymore. I needed to talk to you before it's too late." I didn't even entertain the "before it's too late" bit because I was livid, but something told me to keep my cool. I sat up and said, "Look, I really want to talk to you too, but not like this. Please just leave and I promise we'll talk tomorrow. Call me tomorrow, okay?" He gets up and walks over to my side of the bed and starts rubbing my shoulders and slowly making his way to my neck. He says, "Do you really want to talk?" I look him in the eyes and say, "Yes, I've been wanting to talk to you, but not like this. Please, just call me tomorrow." He stares at me while rubbing my neck and goes down to my shoulders. Finally, he lets go. All he says is okay. This motherfucker proceeds to exit right through my patio door and jumps my patio wall, which tells me exactly how he got in. I freak the fuck out. I check on my kid, but he has no idea what's going on. I locked all my doors and I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next day I text him and I tell him that if I ever see him near me or in my complex, I'll call the police and to never contact me again. If you're wondering why I didn't call the cops to begin with, One, I knew he had a gun, so I was scared of being retaliated against for being a snitch, and I figured if I called the cops they probably wouldn't do much, or just let him out. I was afraid of what he would do after the fact. Either way, he left me alone, and I didn't hear from him for years. 4 years later, I'm going through Facebook, and I see his face and the people you may know. I click on the picture and notice that it looks like a jail picture. You know, those pictures where the guy is clearly in a jail cell. I scroll down the page, and his most recent post is him posting his address for his family members to write to, a prison address. So I Google his name. Sure enough, articles after articles, all with the same headline: Man arrested on suspicion of killing girlfriend. About 2 years after him and I dated, he shot and killed the girl he was dating at the time. That could have been me, and I feel like shit thinking if there was anything I could have done to stop him. Even scarier thought, though, is that he only got 12 years for her murder. I'd like to share with you a series of horrific events from my childhood that we never really had a real resolution to. There were some suspects, but no one was ever brought to justice. Also, there have been a lot of terrible things happening on my mom's property. That's another story, but here's part of the beginning. This part of the story happened roughly around 1990, during my summer break from school. But it continued on for quite some time. I must have been about 2nd or 3rd grade age. I grew up with just my mom. My dad was never in the picture, so we lived all alone until I was about 12 when she remarried. Our secluded country neighborhood was safe for the most part, and all of our immediate neighbors were elderly, save for one couple who had a few young adult sons around my brother's age. For the most part, though, didn't have much riffraff in the area. At first, there were only minor clues to indicate something was going on. Things being moved in the backyard, and I guess because my mother has always been a paranoid conspiracy theorist, she had an idea that something was happening. I didn't really know this until I heard her talking about it much later after the events. She tried to hide things from me so I wouldn't get scared. She even started sleeping in my room with me at night, probably because she was paranoid. I assumed it was because we could stay up late and watch movies together and eat snacks. One morning after I got up, I noticed that our old wooden back door had huge chunks missing out of it, around the part where the lock and bolt goes into the door frame. It was as if someone was trying to chip away at the locked part. I showed my mom what I had discovered, not realizing why the door was damaged. She went completely silent, pale-faced, and panicked. I could tell something was wrong, but I was too young to understand that someone had tried to break in, either in the night or while we were out. That day, she mended the door to the best of her ability, and if I remember correctly, she even put a new and different lock on it from the hardware store. She also filed a police report, but of course there was nothing they could do. I had a German shepherd named Munchie. He was a big spoiled baby who loved raiding the fridge with me, but to a stranger he was probably very intimidating. He was my best friend, and very watchful over me. I still miss him to this day. For a week or two after Mom and I would go to bed, Munchie would start pacing around and whining, acting very anxious. Since we lived in such a rural place with no imminent danger, or so we thought, Mom would frequently let him outside by himself. So one night, while he was acting exceptionally strange, she let him outside alone. We didn't have central air because our house was old, built in the 50s. We were poor, and Kentucky summers weren't really too hot anyway. At night, Mom would open up all the windows in the house, with the halfway burglar latch, of course. Since she was in my room with me watching a movie, we both had my bedroom windows all the way up. My back window overlooked a bit of a hill, which gradually sloped into a low, wide bottom. The bottom was full of tall weeds and bushes. Suddenly we heard movement in the brush of the bottom. Munchie. Then we heard him snarling like a werewolf. Mom got up and ran to the window but couldn't see anything. What we heard next was terrifying. It sounded as if Munchie was attacking someone. He was making these awful noises, as if he was eating someone alive. I began to cry, terrified that something would happen to my best friend. My mom started screaming in horror for Munchie to come home. We heard what sounded like someone escaping my dog's wrath and taking off through the brush. My mom ran to the back door with me right behind her and called for Munchie at the top of her lungs until he came running back into the house. He was panting and grunting and bristled up. I hugged him so tight I probably nearly squeezed the life out of him. As time progressed, things got worse. Being so young, I didn't know for a long time, but my mom was safeguarding the house. She even moved a tall dresser in front of my window that overlooked the hill and bottom. She tried her best, but whoever was harassing us would always find new ways to make our life hell, or maybe try to kill us. One night she said she heard peculiar noises coming from the backyard. I don't necessarily remember this, so I called her for details before writing this. The sounds were coming from under the dining room windows, which overlooked the backyard. She turned on the security light on the back of the house and saw a ladder propped up against the back of our house, as if someone was trying to climb through our windows. This incident seemed like more of an empty threat than a real attempt, especially considering the back door was probably easier access. We don't know if the person thought the windows would be unlocked or what, but for whatever reason they gave it a try. Again, she called our local police, and they did nothing. I should probably note that we didn't really have much law enforcement here. You probably wouldn't believe me if I tried to tell you how worthless they were, and still are in that area. On another occasion, and this memory is burned into my brain because it scared me so bad, someone snuck right up to my bedroom window one night. I hate to even think what their intentions might have been. My mom had already drifted off to sleep, but I was quietly watching the rest of Willy Wonka. I was looking in the direction of my ominous window, the one overlooking the bottom, so I ended up getting a good look at this big white hand, which reached up and slapped my window screen multiple times in rapid succession. I screamed. Mom woke up and the tormentor took off, no doubt through the brushy bottom. My mom is a dog person. She adores dogs, and has always had lots of dogs and puppies around. We had 7 little black pups and the mother dog around this time. They lived outside on our huge property. They had plenty of space to play and a nice big doghouse. At some point around the same time this stuff was happening, we had to be out of town for a few days. Mom had some people watching the house, and I guess she didn't really think anything horrendous would happen. Then again, she wasn't aware of just how far this thing would go. When we came home, Mom's puppies had been killed and lined up in a row in the side yard close to my window that overlooked the bottom. This was devastating. The police did little to help, except for telling her how short to saw off her shotgun so that it was still legal, and advising us to keep Munchie at home. I forgot to ask, but I'm nearly positive my mom ended up sending the mom doggy away to my sister's house on the other side of town. Months later, the incidents were still increasing in occurrence, and then someone decided to take it way too far. Something hit the back of the house in the wee hours of the morning. My mom looked out the windows and saw nothing, at least not until the next morning. She found a stick with a charred pine knot on it. Apparently someone had lit it on fire and threw it at our house. I assume they were hoping our house would burn with us in it. And don't even ask about the cops, because they did nothing yet again. I wouldn't be surprised if they even knew who the culprit was and didn't care. Then one day, Munchie went missing. He had gone out to the bathroom in the evening before bed, but he didn't come back immediately like always. He vanished. I don't even want to go into detail about this because it breaks my heart all over again, but we found him a few days later. He had been poisoned. And to be completely honest, I could keep going with this story, although it takes a lot of unbelievable turns, not all of them horrifying, some just ridiculous. Then around 2009, a multiple-year-long court case began where my mom had to fight a group of her neighbors in court to keep them from stealing her property. Those events led us to believe the people involved with that case may have had something to do with the torment we experienced all those years ago, but honestly all we can do is assume. So, tormentor, I wish we could meet, but you're a coward who harasses women and children and hurts animals.
This is one of the weirdest things that's ever happened to me. My family lived out in the middle of nowhere, at least an hour or so drive into town. So, whenever the family wanted to go and visit relatives or friends, it took a really long time to get anywhere. Of course, when I became a teenager, I had to stay home more often due to schoolwork. Or at least, that was the excuse I used in order to get to remain home by myself. This was in the late fall. My parents and sister had gone out to visit my aunt and uncle. I stayed home that time, though, to supposedly work on my homework. I honestly really can't remember whether I had any to do or not, but I guess that's not really important. Our house was situated on top of a hill. It was a real beautiful place, too. The yard was huge, both in the front and back, but the front yard was much larger. The only thing, though, that we kept in the backyard was this old shed. It was an old wooden shed and seemed almost older than the house was. There were a lot of really old tools when we first moved in, too, but we never really used them for anything. There I was watching TV. It was a little while after the sun had gone down at this point in time. We had a dog at the time, a collie. I was sitting in the couch in the living room and he had spent some time sleeping at my feet. At some point, though, the dog just randomly perked up. It caught my attention right away because I assumed he must have heard something. He was doing that thing dogs do when they perceive something that we don't. He kept looking around anxiously, too. After a few moments, the dog got up. He walked through the living room, then into the kitchen. The kitchen faced the backyard. There were these sliding glass doors, so I figured the pup just wanted to go outside and use the bathroom. I got up and walked over to the sliding glass door. I opened it up and let the dog run out. He immediately started barking, though, in what seemed like an extremely aggressive way. I then closed the door and turned on the back porch light. Once I did, though, the dog just kept barking. He wouldn't get off the porch either. At first, I couldn't tell exactly what it was he was barking at. Then, though, I noticed the scariest thing I had ever seen in my life. The door to the old shed swung wide open, and this gigantic dude came out of it. He was carrying one of the old tools, a big pickaxe. I slid the door back open and hurriedly called the dog back in. The man stared over at us and watched us. He didn't move at first. It took a moment to get the dog back into the house, but he finally came in. I locked the door right away, even though I knew it was a futile thing to do. If the guy really wanted to get in and hurt me, it's not like a glass door would stop a pickaxe. I took the dog through the basement door. I locked that, and we ran down the stairs. I began looking around to see if there was anything I could use as a weapon. I had no idea who the hell this guy was, or why he was here. The only thing I could find in the basement to protect myself was an old baseball bat. While I was in the middle of grabbing it, I heard a crash from the upstairs. It sounded like he'd broken down a regular door, though, not the glass one. The sound was terrifying, because now I knew there was a huge guy with a pickaxe in my house. I tried hiding under the stairs with the dog and bat held close to me. It didn't take long before he made his way over to the basement door. He began pounding on it heavily, and finally busted it open. I was scared that he really was going to come kill me. "I know you're down there," he said in a large, gruff voice. "The axe isn't for you, but you never saw me. Do you understand?" I wasn't even able to reply. I just cowered there with the dog. "You never saw me. Do you understand? Answer me or I'm coming down there myself." "I never saw you, I promise," I yelled back at him. There was a quiet moment. Then he answered back with words I'll never forget. "If you tell anyone you saw me, I'll come back for you." "I never saw anything," I repeated. There was another quiet moment. "Good. You better not forget it." I heard the man leave and open the sliding glass door. I waited in the basement for a long time with the dog. I was too scared to come out. I didn't know if the guy had actually left, if he would keep his promise, or if he was just messing with me. I had no idea, but I was extremely terrified. When I eventually came up, there was very little actual damage to the house. There was definitely no one still there, though. I tried to clean everything up and lock up as good as possible. I initially thought I should call 911, but in the end I didn't. I hate to admit this, but I was too scared by his threat to tell anyone. When my parents came home, it took a lot of courage to explain to them what happened. I was extremely scared while we talked about it. I couldn't keep it from them though in the end because the house was damaged, but I didn't give them the best description either. As far as I know, nothing ever happened with that guy. There were no murders or break-ins or anything like that reported that I heard of. I don't know why that guy specifically wanted our pickaxe. I can only hope that he didn't use it to hurt anyone. We lived in a really hilly area. That's the best way I can think to describe it. We lived right at the bottom of a hill just off a dirt road. There was another house sitting right on top of a steep hill, right across the street from us. Although we lived in this house for a really long time, the other house was a rental property, so there were often a lot of different people who would rent there for short amounts of time. I don't exactly remember a whole lot about most of the renters, but there is one that I will never forget. The father was a truck driver, and wasn't around that much due to this, but when he was, the semi-cab was parked right on top of the steep driveway. It always kind of freaked me out, because if it ever rolled down the hill by accident, it would have gone right through our house. One of the kids who lived in the house was really obsessed with horror movies, mostly Freddy Krueger actually. He was also the sort who liked to try and scare people, but unfortunately for him, he was never actually really any good at it. One night, after everyone had gone to bed, I stayed up watching some movies. At one point, though, I decided to go outside on the porch and watch the fireflies. Snuck a beer out, too, and had a nice relaxing time observing the scenery and drinking it. After a while, I saw the light in the living room from the house up on the hill go off. I didn't think too much about it, but after a while, I noticed that it looked like someone was creeping around the house. It was very, very dark though, so I couldn't quite be sure. The only light was over by the truck, but I could tell that perhaps it had to be that kid. It was someone dressed like Freddy Krueger after all. I knew it had to be him because of his obsession with that character. At the time, he even had the board game. I called out to him, "I know it's you, Johnny." He disappeared behind the house. I kept watching, and after a while, I watched him emerge from behind it. He crept over to the semi-cab, climbed into it, and quietly closed the door. Then a series of things happened that I'll never forget. I heard this strange noise, and I watched that Freddy Krueger jump out of the cab. The cab began to slowly roll down the hill, picking up speed. It was aimed right towards my house. It seemed like I was frozen in time, but I'm sure the long moment that I was sitting there was only a second or two. I jumped up and ran into the house screaming. I tried to get my parents and sisters to wake up. They all quickly came into the living room, and I screamed at them to get out of the house. Before they had a chance to try and calm me down, I ran out the back door, and they thankfully all followed me. It was fortunate that the truck was apparently stuck in neutral, so it didn't start rolling down the hill super fast. We didn't get out of the house in the nick of time or anything. We actually had some time to spare, but there was nothing we could do but watch as the cab rolled down that steep hill, across the road, and slammed into our small house. I can't seriously tell you what it was like. I mean, it was almost like something you would see from an action movie, but obviously not as cool in real life. It didn't go totally all the way through the house, but it smashed itself in and embedded itself very deeply. If I hadn't gotten my family up in time, I have no doubt they could have been injured or even killed. So what happened after that? Well, my dad ran up to the house on the hill and began pounding on the door. He was demanding that Johnny be taken out of the house. The parents came out and there was a lot of yelling, of course. Johnny came out though, dressed completely normal and acting like he had been sleeping the entire time. Well, the problem was there was no way anyone could prove that Johnny had actually done it. Everything I'd noticed was completely circumstantial. I thought it had been him because he loved Freddy Krueger, but no costume was ever found. In fact, his parents refused to buy him anything like that because they despised horror. They did, however, have to pay for the house. Having the truck cab parked like it was happened to be very dangerous. If they had parked it sideways, then it would definitely not have rolled down the hill like that. Those people moved out not long after that, but that was definitely the scariest moment of my life. I once came upon a really terrifying incident completely by chance. It happened when I was 13 years old, when I had what was probably the worst day in my entire life. Now, I didn't always get along with my older brother. I mean, I did a lot more when we got older, but we would get into fights a lot when we were younger, like brothers often did. He was also a lot bigger than me too, so when we were in our teenage years, he could really be a dick, and that made it hard to defend myself. We moved around a whole lot at the time, and when this happened, we were actually living in my aunt's house. This is a little weird, and I probably shouldn't even explain it, but at the time, she was given a job and a free place to live. She didn't want to sell the house, but it was too far out into the country for her to commute to the new job. So, we moved in there. We weren't big city people by any means, but it was the first time in my life I really lived right out in the middle of nowhere. My dad and stepmother would often go off random places, visit people, get real drunk, that sort of thing. Whenever they did, my brother and I would be home alone, sometimes for a very long time. I'm talking days long. Well, this time on a hot summer day, my brother and I had been alone at home for several days now. My parents were visiting relatives about 4 hours away. My brother, as usual, would get into his bossy mood, and it would really anger the hell out of me. This was probably around 10 p.m. at night. My brother was just being a total jackass, trying to order me around. He would tell me things like get up and make him a sandwich or something. He would also send me into the other room so he could secretly watch my father's porn tapes. I got real tired of it at some point, so I just went and left the house. It was all just getting to be too much, so I thought that a long walk along the road would make me feel a lot better. I left the house and started jogging along it. God, it was so hot out that night. I began sweating bad as soon as I got out. I was too annoyed and a bit scared of my brother, though, to go back. Now, this was a very, very rural area, and we had not been living there long at all, so I had no idea where I was heading. I was also one of those people who would go for a walk and get really lost deep in my thoughts. The road was ground level, but eventually branched off into the hills. I decided to continue my walk through that area. As I walked out further on the road, I began to get a little scared, actually. There were more and more trees, and it was beginning to get really, really dark outside. I kept pondering to myself when I should turn around and try to go back. Suddenly, I heard a creepy voice call out from the dark in the woods. "Why are you walking in my woods?" "What the hell?" I exclaimed. "You know, it's easy to murder in the dark," I heard the voice reply. It was coming from a little bit up the hill. I looked and saw there was a shadow standing there. It wasn't very perceptible, but I could see he was there. "You know, I can see you," I stupidly replied. "Oh, then I'll come a bit closer," he said. I began seeing him heading fast down the hill. I moved to get away, but as I ran to the far side of the road, I tripped on some gravel and began tumbling down the very large hill. I kept rolling, unable to find my balance, hitting things along the way and getting completely scratched up. It was terrible, and I was in a ton of pain by the time I eventually stopped rolling. When I got up, though, I couldn't see the guy anywhere. I didn't think he wanted me to follow down that long hill trip, but I ran the rest of the way home and finally made it to the road anyway. I was completely tired and exhausted and scared out of my mind. Walking home was terrifying. It was pitch dark, and I kept expecting to run into that guy again. Thankfully, I was able to get home safe and sound. Here's the good part of the story, though. When I told the story to my brother, he became completely enraged. He loved to pick on me, but he never liked it when anyone else did. He grabbed my dad's rifle and took me out to the car. He demanded I show him where it happened. I had to ride in the car back to the spot that I had the scariest moment of my life not long ago. When we got there, my brother got out of the car with a rifle, demanding the man show himself. He even actually fired it a few times randomly into the woods. It was crazy and hella scary. We didn't find the guy, and eventually my brother calmed down and we went home. But he still talks about that story even today. What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here as always. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. If you guys enjoyed the video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you have any comments or feedback on what I could do better, or you just want to talk about the stories in the video, please be sure to leave them in the comments down below. I try to read every comment that comes, and I really enjoy hearing your guys' thoughts. Before anything else, I would like to give a special thanks to my friend Killer Orange Cat who allowed me to use these stories today. You can find a link to his channel in the description below, as well as a link to the Reddit post where these stories are found. He does some great work, so if you like these stories, be sure to check him out, as he has lots of ones that nobody has ever read before. If you guys want to contact me for any reason, or you would like to send a story in with a submission, please be sure to check in the description below the video. You'll find links to all of my social media, including my Gmail, Facebook, and Twitter accounts. Send me a message on any of those, and I'll try to get back to you as soon as possible. If you do decide to send in a story submission, please be sure to include what the type of story it is, if it has one, the name of the story, and how you would like to be credited in the description of the video the story appears in. Also, please be sure to format it properly and use proper grammar so it's easier to read if I actually use it in a submission for a video. Also, be sure to include as much detail as you are possibly comfortable with sharing. Overall, guys, I think that's pretty much about it for now. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.